They told him an alpha never begs, never bleeds in front of witnesses, never lets the Empire see the crack running through the foundation. For 7 years, King Vaelor Nightbane believed that, built a throne on it, poured everything he had into a kingdom that rewarded strength and buried its wounded. Then one winter morning, a report lands on his war table. A child living in the cursed forest, born from bloodlines that should never have touched. And suddenly the most powerful ruler in the wolf world realizes the empire he built might be the very thing trying to destroy him. Drop your city in the comments. This story belongs to all of us. The war room smelled of burnt tallow and old iron. It always did at this hour, when the candles burned low and the maps sprawled across the oak table like the flayed skin of a continent. Vaelor stood at the far end of that table, alone, the way he preferred. His advisors had been dismissed an hour ago. The guards stationed outside the iron doors had been ordered to silence. Even the fire in the stone hearth had settled into a low, sullen crackle, as if it too understood that certain moments required the absence of witnesses. He was studying the Thornvale forest. The map marked it in faded gray ink, a spreading snarl of woodland that occupied the northeastern borderlands the way a wound occupies flesh. Not cleanly, not neatly, but with a kind of insistent permanence that defied every attempt to contain it. Generations of cartographers had tried to map its interior and returned either empty-handed or not at all. The clans who once lived along its edges had long since abandoned those settlements, driven out by things that moved between the trees at night and left no tracks come morning. No rational person chose to live inside the Thornvale. That was what Councillor Dravith had said when he delivered the report, standing at the chamber threshold with the flat, rehearsed calm of a man presenting facts he expected to be disbelieved. He had laid the parchment on the table, smoothed its edges with 2 fingers, and then taken precisely 1 step backward. "We have confirmation," he had said, "from 3 separate sources. A woman, an Omega. She has been living inside the forest perimeter for approximately 7 years. She is not alone." Vaelor had not looked up from the fire. Define not alone. A pause. Dravith's throat moved. "There is a child, my king. A boy. Approximately 7 years of age." He looked up then. He had been looking at the map ever since. A child born 7 years ago, deep inside a forest where nothing lived by choice, raised by an Omega woman who had managed to remain invisible to the Empire's entire intelligence network for the full span of that child's life. That alone was remarkable enough to demand attention. But it was the second page of Dravith's report, the page the counselor had hesitated before placing on the table, that had emptied the room. The boy carried 2 bloodlines. Not 1. 2. Both of them were supposed to be extinct. Vaelor pressed 2 fingers against the map, against the gray mass of the Thornvale, and he stood there long enough for the candles to burn another inch. His jaw was tight. The muscles along the back of his neck had not released since he read those words, and he was aware of that tension the way a man becomes aware of an old injury in cold weather. Not acutely painful, but persistent, a reminder that something beneath the surface had never fully healed. 7 years ago, he had made a decision. It had been the kind of decision that could not be undone and could not be spoken aloud. The kind that lives in a locked room inside a man's chest and accumulates dust. And he had long since convinced himself that the room was sealed tight enough to make no difference to the kingdom he had built since. Apparently not. He folded the report, slid it into the interior pocket of his coat, and reached for the iron cup of water on the edge of the table. It had gone cold an hour ago. He drank it anyway, standing there with the map spread before him and the fire dying at his back, and he allowed himself exactly 30 seconds to feel what the report had stirred. That old, cold dread, and underneath it something harder to name, something closer to grief. And then he put it down. He had become very skilled at putting things down. He pulled on his riding coat, buckled the strap across his chest, and crossed to the door. The guard outside straightened immediately. "Bring me Captain Holt," Vaelor said. "We ride at dawn." The Thornvale announced itself before they reached its edge. The temperature dropped first, not gradually, the way it does when weather changes, but sharply, in the span of a single breath, as if the forest had drawn a line across the ground and declared the air on the far side its own. The horses felt it. Vaelor's mount, a gray stallion named Crest, who had survived 6 military campaigns without flinching at cannon fire, pulled against the reins and set his hooves with the particular reluctance of an animal that has learned to trust its instincts. "Easy," Vaelor said quietly, and the horse steadied but did not relax. Captain Holt rode alongside him, a lean, weathered man of 40 who had served under 3 previous kings before Vaelor consolidated the throne. He had the kind of face that years of hard living had carved down to its essential structure: prominent cheekbones, deep-set eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been set in iron rather than bone. He was not a man given to unnecessary speech, which was one of the primary reasons Vaelor kept him close. "The scouts confirm she's still there?" Vaelor asked. "As of last night." Holt glanced sideways at the tree line. They tracked smoke from a fire approximately 2 miles in. She doesn't build fires at night, apparently. Only midday, when the canopy disperses the smoke enough to prevent sighting from above. Disciplined. Very. They rode in silence for a moment. Behind them, the company of 12 soldiers maintained their formation with the muffled clink of armor and the rhythm of hooves on hard ground. Vaelor had deliberately kept the escort small. A full military deployment would announce itself for miles. More importantly, he needed to see this woman before she ran, and Omegas with 7 years of survival instinct did not wait for the arrival of royal banners. "What do we know about her?" Vaelor asked. Holt reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded sheet without looking at it. He had already committed its contents to memory. Name is Seraphine Ashmore. Former records place her in the northern settlements before the Consolidation Wars. She was registered as an unaffiliated Omega. No pack, no pledged territory. She disappears from official record approximately 7.5 years ago. A beat. Around the same time as the Veldrath incident. Vaelor did not react. His left hand tightened on the reins slightly and then released. "The child," he said. "What do we know about the child?" "Less. The scouts couldn't get close enough for a clear sighting. What they reported—" Holt paused. It was a specific kind of pause, the pause of a man choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. What they reported was that the boy doesn't move like a child. He moves like something that has spent its entire life being hunted. The horses entered the tree line. The forest swallowed the sky. But she heard them at the creek crossing. Seraphine had not needed to hear their footsteps or the distant metallic shift of a soldier's gear. She had felt them the way she felt everything that entered her forest. Through that deep sensory frequency she had spent 7 years sharpening until it was less of an instinct and more of a fact, as reliable as the ground beneath her feet. She was at the fire pit, turning the morning's catch over the low flame, when the awareness arrived. 12 heartbeats, maybe 14. Too many for hunters, too quiet for a trading party. She was on her feet before the fish had finished turning. "Kaelin." Her voice was flat, carrying no panic because panic taught a child to be afraid of the wrong things. She had learned that early, in the first terrifying months, when the forest itself had seemed hostile, and she had discovered that her son read her face more carefully than he read the shadows around them. "Get your boots." The boy emerged from the shelter with the particular alertness of a child who has been trained since birth to treat the word boots as a different kind of word from all the others. He was small for 7, lean in the way that children raised on forest rations become lean, with dark eyes that were too steady for his age and a quality of attention that adults twice his years rarely possessed. He read her face now, quickly, and reached for his boots without questions. "How many?" he asked. "Enough. Is it them?" She looked at him then, fully looked at him, the way she permitted herself to do when she needed to remember why she had done every hard thing she had done. He was studying her with those dark, too steady eyes, and she thought, as she had thought hundreds of times before, that he looked nothing like fear. He looked like everything fear was afraid of. "Put your boots on," she said. "We're not running." That surprised him. She saw it in the fractional widening of his eyes, the brief interruption of his composure. In 7 years, running had always been the answer. "We're not?" he asked. "No." She pulled her long coat from the peg inside the shelter, shrugged into it, and checked the knife at her hip. Not because she intended to use it, but because the weight of it had become a kind of posture, and she needed her posture correct right now. "You stay behind me. You say nothing unless I tell you. And whatever you see, whatever happens, you do not let your power loose. Not one thread of it, Do you understand me? Kalen pulled the second boot on and stood up. He was looking at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his processing face. The expression he wore when he was cataloging information and running it against everything he already knew, like a small, serious scholar taking inventory. "Okay," he said finally. She took his hand. They walked toward the creek. Vaelor smelled the fire before he saw her. He had sent Holt and the soldiers to form a loose perimeter, not surrounding, not threatening, but present, and he rode forward alone, which was either the kind of calculated strategy that had won him 6 wars or the kind of calculated stupidity that ended kings. He had been told before that the difference between those two things was usually just the outcome. He came through the tree line into a clearing roughly 40 feet across. She was standing at the creek's edge. He had expected, without consciously articulating the expectation, to find a woman diminished by 7 years of isolation, hollow-cheeked, skittish, worn to the bone by survival. The report had described an omega, and his mind, shaped by decades of hierarchical law and its corresponding imagery, had translated that word into a particular picture. The picture was wrong. She was not diminished. She was stripped down, the way a blade gets stripped down when a skilled hand removes everything that isn't essential. And what remained was precise and still, and watching him with gray eyes that contained no fear whatsoever. She had the kind of stillness that isn't peaceful. It was the stillness of a person who has decided something and is waiting to see if the world intends to argue about it. Her hand was resting at her hip, near the knife. Not on it. Near it. Behind her, partially obscured by her coat, was the child. Vaelor stopped his horse at the clearing's edge. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The creek moved between them, shallow and quick, and the forest pressed in on both sides, and the quality of the silence was the quality of 2 people performing an assessment simultaneously and arriving at conclusions they hadn't expected. "You're the king," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," he said. "You rode in yourself." She didn't look at the tree line, but her awareness of the soldiers placed somewhere in the forest behind him was obvious. "Small company, no announcement banners. You wanted to see us before we could hide." "Yes." Her jaw shifted slightly. He couldn't tell if that was acknowledgement or something colder. "Then you already know what he is," she said. "I know what the reports say he is. And you came anyway." Her eyes moved over him slowly. Over the riding coat, the unadorned posture, the absence of the ceremonial armor a king sending a message would have worn. Without an army. "I didn't come to make war on a woman and a child," he said. "That's a remarkably low bar," she said flatly. "Most kings wouldn't bother clearing it." He almost smiled. He didn't. "My name is Vaelor." "I know your name." She said it with the particular tone of someone who knows a great deal more than just the name. "What do you want?" "To see him," he said, "and to talk to you." A pause. The creek moved. Behind her, the boy shifted, not retreating, just repositioning, the way a person shifts their weight when they're preparing to hold their ground. "You can dismount," she said finally. "Leave the horse at the tree line, and keep your hands where I can see them." It was not the kind of instruction anyone delivered to a reigning monarch. Vaelor dismounted. Tick. She had built the fire pit with river stones, each one placed with the careful geometry of someone who had too much time and too much threat to be casual about anything. He sat across the cold ash from her, on a flat stone that was clearly the designated visitor's seat, because it was the only stone positioned at a deliberate angle to both the fire and the shelter entrance. She had been prepared for company. Not expecting it, but prepared. The boy was inside the shelter, visible through the open entrance, sitting with his back against the far wall, watching. "He doesn't speak?" Vaelor asked. "He's listening," she said. "There's a difference." "Smart." "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her directly. She met it without adjusting, without looking away, which was a thing he noticed because most people in his immediate presence either performed effortful eye contact or avoided it entirely, and the performance was always more exhausting than the avoidance. She was doing neither. She was just looking at him. "I need to know what happened 7 years ago," he said. "You already know what happened 7 years ago." "I know the official version." Something moved through her expression then. Not quite pain, not quite anger, but a blend of both that had been aged past its sharpest edges and arrived at something harder and more enduring. She was quiet for a moment. The Veldrath Summit, she said. 2 delegations that weren't supposed to be in the same territory. A negotiation that was never meant to succeed. And 2 people who were assigned to the same camp and discovered that the laws governing bloodline separation were easier to ignore in the dark than anyone who wrote those laws had bothered to account for. Her voice was even. Deliberately even, the way a voice becomes even when a person has rehearsed their own history often enough that the telling of it has been excavated of its original terror. "You were assigned to the Veldrath camp," he said. "I was there to translate. Omega labor. The kind of assignment that pays in the suggestion that you might be allowed to keep your registration papers if you're cooperative." She paused. "His father was—" "I know who his father was." The words came out with more weight than he intended. She noticed. Her eyes sharpened. "Then you know that the child who resulted from that night is, according to every law currently governing this empire, something that should have been reported and eliminated before his first birthday." She let that land. "And I'd like you to explain to me exactly why I should have done that. I'm not here to argue the law." "Then what are you here to argue?" He was quiet for a moment. The creek moved. Somewhere above the canopy a bird called once and went silent. "I'm here," he said, "because the Covenant knows about him. And they have been moving toward this forest for 3 weeks." The color did not leave her face. Her face did not change. But something beneath the stillness shifted. A seismic adjustment, deep and invisible. The kind that happens when a person's internal architecture receives information it has been bracing for without knowing it was bracing. "You're sure?" she said. "We intercepted a courier 4 days ago. The message was encoded, but not well enough." He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet. Not Dravith's report, a different document, shorter, its edges worn from handling. He held it out across the fire pit. "They know his bloodline. They know what it means." She took it, read it. Her eyes moved across the words quickly, the reading of someone whose literacy had been put to survival use rather than academic exercise, and when she reached the bottom, her jaw tightened in the specific way of a person absorbing information their body doesn't want to absorb. "They call him the Key," she said. "Yes. They've been building toward this for how long? Our intelligence suggests the Covenant has been positioning assets in the Northern Territories for approximately 2 years," he paused, "which means they identified him approximately a year before we did." She set the paper down. She was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence he watched her do what he had learned to recognize as the specific cognitive work of a person recalculating survival under fundamentally changed conditions. Not panicking, not freezing, recalculating. The way a soldier caught in an ambush doesn't collapse when the initial plan fails. They immediately, without ceremony, begin building the next plan. "How long do we have?" she asked. "At the pace they're moving. 3 days? Maybe 4. And your proposal is to bring us back to the capital?" "Yes. Where an imperial council that doesn't know Kalen exists is going to have to be informed of his existence, which will trigger a political crisis of considerable proportions." "Yes." "And where the Covenant will simply follow us." "Yes." He met her eyes. "The difference is that in Moonspire I control the terrain." She looked at him for a long moment. "You understand," she said quietly, "that once he enters that city, there is no version of this where he walks back out as an ordinary child. Whatever future I manage to preserve for him by living out here, in this forest, in this—" She gestured, a precise, contained gesture that somehow encompassed 7 years of cold mornings and solitary decisions and the particular weight of raising a child without anyone in the world knowing he existed. "That future is gone the moment you put him in front of the Empire." "I know that. And you're asking me to accept that." "I'm not asking you to accept it," he said. "I'm telling you that the alternative is waiting here for 3 more days while 300 Covenant soldiers enter the forest from 6 different directions." He paused. "I don't want to bring him to Moonspire because it's safe. I'm bringing him because every other option is worse." She was quiet. From inside the shelter, the boy's voice came, level and clear. "Mom." She turned. Kalen was standing in the shelter entrance now. He was looking at Vaelor, not with the wariness of a child confronted by a stranger in power, but with a kind of direct, attentive assessment that landed with unsettling weight, because it was far too close to the expression his mother wore, and also because it was the first time Vaelor had seen the boy clearly, in full light, without the filter of distance. The eyes. The eyes were the wrong color for an Omega bloodline. They were not wrong in a subtle way. They were wrong in a way that would immediately announce itself to anyone with a generation's worth of knowledge about the clans and their distinct physical markers. Amber at the iris, deepening to something almost gold at the edges, the color of banked fire. That was not his mother's bloodline looking back at him. That was the other one. Vaelor's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with threat assessment. "We should go," Kalen said. He looked at his mother. "He's telling the truth about the numbers. I can feel them. They're farther away than he thinks, but they're moving faster." Seraphine stared at her son. Then she looked at Vaelor. "He can feel them," she said. There was no performance in it. The statement held the flatness of a woman who had spent 7 years watching her child do impossible things and had constructed a life entirely around protecting the world from finding out. "How far?" Vaelor asked. Kalen was quiet for a moment, his chin slightly lifted, his eyes unfocused in the particular way of a person listening to something beyond normal hearing. 2 days, the boy said. 70 or 80 of them on the eastern approach. Another group to the north, smaller, but they have hounds. Vaelor was already on his feet. "We leave now," he said. "Pack what you can carry in 10 minutes. Seraphine looked at him for one final moment. And in that moment, before she turned to pack 7 years of survival into whatever could be carried in 10 minutes, something crossed her face that he wouldn't be able to name until much later. It was not surrender. It was not trust. It was the expression of a woman stepping off the edge of the life she had built and refusing, on principle, to look down. "If you betray him," she said, "I will burn everything you've built." "I believe you," he said. They rode hard. Vaelor set the pace at the front with Holt at his right and Seraphine at his left, the boy on a soldier's horse between them, and the company of 12 arranged around them in a protective formation that moved through the Thornvale's darkness with disciplined efficiency. The forest was not cooperative. The path the scouts had mapped on the way in seemed different on the way out, narrower, more resistant, the branches lower and the undergrowth thicker, as if the forest itself was making its opinion known about the removal of the thing that had been living at its center for 7 years. They had been riding for 2 hours when the first sound reached them from the eastern dark. Not hooves, not voices. Something else, a low, sustained vibration at the edge of audibility, the kind of sound that doesn't register as sound immediately, but arrives first as a sensation in the teeth. Holt's hand was on his sword hilt before he'd finished turning toward it. "What is that?" he said. Vaelor held up one fist, the gesture for stillness. The company froze. 12 horses and 12 humans went motionless, breathing through their noses. The only sound the distant creak and the forest settling and the strange low frequency that was definitely getting louder. From behind him, Seraphine said very quietly, "Kalen." "I know," the boy said. Vaelor turned in his saddle. Kalen was sitting absolutely still on the soldier's horse, his spine straight, his face tipped slightly upward. His eyes were open and focused on nothing visible. The amber at the iris had brightened, incrementally, but enough to be visible in the dark. Around his right hand, dim and pulsing, was a thin coil of light. Gold amber, the color of banked fire. "He's not doing it on purpose," Seraphine said, and her voice carried the specific calm of a woman who has learned to explain impossible things without making them sound impossible. "Something is agitating the bond." "What bond?" Holt asked. "The covenant," Vaelor said. He was already pulling his horse around, already reading the terrain, already calculating. His voice was flat and operational because operational was what the situation required. "They're using a signal call. It's designed to activate—" He stopped. He looked at the boy. He looked at the light curling around the boy's hand, growing brighter now, pulsing with a rhythm that matched something deep and pre-rational in Vaelor's own chest. And from the eastern dark, 60 feet ahead on the forest path, a figure stepped out from between the trees. It was wearing the gray robes of a forest traveler. It was not a forest traveler. It stood in the center of the path and raised one hand, and from that hand came the same frequency, the same bone-deep vibration, but louder now, close enough to feel, and behind it, in the dark between the trees, other shapes were gathering. 1, 3, 7. More. Kaelin made a sound. It was barely a sound, a small, strangled exhale, the sound of a child trying to contain something much larger than a child should have to contain, and the light around his hand spidered up his arm. "Mom," he said. His voice was still controlled, but underneath the control something vast and hot was pressing upward. Seraphine was already moving. She pulled her horse alongside his, reached across, took his free hand and held it, just held it. "Look at me," she said. He looked at her. "Breathe," she said. He breathed. The light didn't go out, but it steadied. Vaelor had drawn his sword. Around him 12 blades cleared 12 scabbards. Holt moved his horse forward to Vaelor's left shoulder. The figure on the path lowered its hand, and then it spoke. "The key belongs to the Covenant," it said. The voice was wrong. Too smooth, too resonant. The voice of a human being with something else behind it. "Step aside, Nightbane. This is not your war." Vaelor looked at that figure, at the shapes accumulating in the dark behind it, at the 7 years of impossible, stubborn survival standing on his left side, holding a boy's hand and telling him to breathe. He looked at the light around the child's arm. He looked at the arm, at the child, at the future. "It is now," he said. The figure raised both hands. The frequency became a roar, and the forest exploded into light. The forest exploded into light, and the first thing Vaelor did was not draw his sword higher or shout a command to his soldiers. The first thing he did was turn his horse sideways, putting 1,200 pounds of trained cavalry animal between the robed figure on the path and the boy. It was not a calculated maneuver. It was instinct. That distinction would matter later when he had time to examine it. For now there was only the roar of the Covenant's frequency splitting the air, the sharp bark of Holt's voice organizing the soldiers into a defensive perimeter, and the light, amber gold and pulsing, climbing further up Kaelin's arm as the boy fought to keep his breathing even. The robed figure stood in the center of the path with both hands raised, and the dark behind it full of gathering shapes, and it was not moving. It was waiting. That patience was more threatening than any charge would have been, because patience in an enemy meant the enemy believed it had already won. "Seraphine," Vaelor said. "I'm here." Her voice came from his left, close, steady. "Can he hold it?" A pause of approximately 1 second. The pause of a mother doing a calculation she'd done 1,000 times before and arriving at an answer she'd hoped not to need tonight. "Not if they keep that frequency going," she said. Vaelor looked at Holt. Holt was already looking at him, waiting with the particular alertness of a man who'd spent enough years in the field to understand that the 3 seconds after a commander receives bad information are the 3 seconds that determine everything. "The source of the frequency," Vaelor said. "Where is it coming from?" Holt scanned the tree line. "Not from the figure. It's resonating from behind. The density is coming from the left flank, through the undergrowth, approximately 20 meters. "There's an anchor point," Vaelor said. "A physical object generating the signal. Take Marin and Koss, find it, destroy it." Holt was already moving. The robed figure on the path lowered one hand. "That was brave," it said, with the smooth, wrong resonance of its not-quite-human voice. "And completely pointless." Vaelor rode forward 4 steps, closing the distance between himself and the figure. Behind him, he heard Seraphine's sharp intake of breath. He did not look back. "Who sent you?" he said. "You already know who sent us." "I want a name." The figure's head tilted. A slight, anatomically incorrect angle, a fraction past the natural range of human neck movement. "Names are for people who expect to walk away from conversations." "Then we're in agreement," Vaelor said, "because I fully expect to walk away." 20 meters to his left, somewhere in the dense undergrowth, there was a sharp crack of something solid being struck, and then a splintering sound, and then the frequency stopped. In the sudden silence, the forest felt different, looser, the way a room feels when someone who has been holding the air hostage finally leaves. Kaelin exhaled audibly. The light around his arm receded, not completely, but enough, pulling back to his hand, dimming to the level of a low and contained ember. The robed figure went very still. That stillness was new. It was not the patient stillness of before. It was something more immediate, more reactive. The stillness of a chess player who has just watched a piece they'd assumed was secured disappear from the board. There are 60 of us, the figure said. I know, Vaelor said, and there are 13 of me. But my 13 are between you and the child, which means your 60 have to come through us first, and I have never in my life made that an easy thing to do. He let that settle. You can test it if you want, or you can go back to whoever sent you and explain that the window for this operation has closed. A long pause. The shapes in the darkness behind the figure had not moved, but their quality had changed. From gathered to uncertain, the subtle shift in a group of people who are no longer sure their orders account for the situation in front of them. The figure lowered both hands. This isn't over, it said. I know that too, Vaelor said. The figure stepped back into the dark between the trees, and the shapes followed, and the forest absorbed them with the quiet efficiency of a thing that has been swallowing human mistakes for centuries. Holt emerged from the undergrowth on the left, wiping something dark from his sword blade, Marin and Koss at his heels. He looked at Vaelor with the flat expression of a man who is reserving judgment on his commander's decisions until they have both had some sleep. We need to move, Holt said. Yes, Vaelor agreed. He turned his horse back toward the group. Seraphine was watching him with those gray eyes that contained no fear and considerable evaluation. The boy was watching him too, the amber in his irises still fractionally brighter than normal, his right hand loosely closed around something invisible. You didn't have to do that, Seraphine said. Ride at it directly. No, Vaelor said. Why did you? He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the boy, at the specific combination of his mother's stillness and his father's fire sitting in the face of a 7-year-old who had just spent 10 minutes not destroying a forest. Because someone needed to, he said. He turned the horse toward Moonspire and set a pace that said the conversation was finished for now. It wasn't finished. They both knew that. But the forest was dark and they had 60 Covenant soldiers somewhere behind them and approximately 40 miles of hard ground between their current position and the capital's walls. And some conversations required more than a forest path and a retreating enemy to do them justice. They reached Moonspire at the gray edge of dawn. The city announced itself the way great things announce themselves. Not all at once, but in increments. First, the smell of it, wood smoke and river water, and the specific mineral sharpness of the silver ore embedded in the mountain the city was carved into. Then the light, the crystal lanterns that lined the approach road still burning against the pre-dawn dark, casting everything in a blue-white clarity that made the stone buildings look like they had been cut from ice rather than quarried from earth. Then the walls themselves, rising above the tree line with the blunt confidence of architecture that has survived multiple generations of people trying to knock it down. Kaelin had fallen asleep against the soldier's shoulder somewhere around the 3rd hour of riding, and Vaelor had made a decision he didn't examine too closely. He'd had the soldier transfer the boy carefully to ride before him, and Kaelin had not woken, just resettled, one small hand gripping the saddle horn in his sleep, with the unconscious tenacity of a child who has learned that the things you hold on to can be taken. Seraphine rode alongside, not close, but not at a distance either. She had been quiet for the past 2 hours, which was not the quiet of exhaustion. Her posture was too alert for that. But the quiet of someone processing a large amount of new information and not yet ready to give any of it a name. At the first gate, the guards recognized the royal standard, and the recognition traveled up the wall in a ripple of voices and movement. By the time they reached the inner courtyard, a small cluster of palace staff had appeared, and with them, descending the eastern stairs with the focused energy of a man who had been awake all night waiting and would not say so, came Counselor Draveth. He stopped at the bottom step. He looked at Seraphine. He looked at the boy in front of Vaelor, on the horse, still asleep, still gripping the saddle horn. His face went through several emotions in rapid succession, like a well-trained instrument playing something it hadn't rehearsed. "My king," he said, and the word "my king" contained approximately 6 different questions. "Council chambers," Vaelor said. 2 hours. Bring Alden and the general. And the Draveth gestured towards Seraphine, an abbreviated gesture that was trying to be tactful and landing closer to alarmed. "She stays with the boy," Vaelor said. "Find them rooms in the east wing. Private. Guarded. And Draveth? The guards are there to keep people out, not to keep them in. If I find out anyone's treated this woman as a prisoner, I'll have a detailed conversation with them about the difference." Draveth absorbed this. "Of course," he said, in the tone of a man absorbing a great many things at once and choosing the most manageable one to start with. Vaelor dismounted. He lifted Kalen from the saddle. The boy stirred, opened his eyes to amber slits, registered his location with that unnerving, quiet assessment, and went back to sleep against Vaelor's shoulder with the trusting immediacy of a child who has decided, in whatever depth he makes decisions, that this is acceptable. Vaelor had carried field-injured soldiers across worse terrain than a palace courtyard. He told himself that was why this didn't feel strange. He handed the boy, carefully, to a servant he trusted, gestured Seraphine toward the east wing stairs, and turned toward Draveth. 2 hours, he said. The council chamber at Moonspire was built to impress. This was its primary architectural function, more fundamental even than its practical use. Every element of it, from the vaulted ceiling painted with the lineage maps of the original founding clans to the long obsidian table that reflected the faces of everyone seated at it, back at themselves in dark mirror image, was designed to make the people inside it feel the weight of the institution they served. It worked. Vaelor had watched even confident men become quieter in this room, their voices dropping, their arguments becoming more careful, as if the room itself were scoring the quality of their thinking. He sat at the head of the table and watched Councillor Draveth, General Kress, and his Chief Intelligence Officer Alden file in and take their positions, and he let them settle into the room's gravity before speaking. The Eclipse Covenant has identified a child living in the Northern Territories, he said. They have deployed a retrieval force. Last night, their advance unit intercepted us in the Thorn Vale. We engaged, disabled their anchor mechanism, and extracted with no casualties. He paused. The child and his mother are currently in the East Wing. Kress, who had the broad, weathered face of a man who had spent 40 years solving problems with organized violence, leaned forward. What child? That's the second matter. Vaelor's voice was even. The child carries the combined bloodlines of Veldrath and Ashmore. The room changed temperature. Alden went very still. Draveth's hands, folded on the table, pressed together fractionally harder. Kress blinked, once, slowly, and then his expression rearranged itself into the careful blankness of a man deciding how to respond to something that is either a crisis or a catastrophe, depending on which direction it falls. That's not possible, Alden said. The Veldrath line was terminated after the consolidation. We have the records. The records, Vaelor said, are incomplete. My king. Draveth's voice was precise and contained. If this child is what you're describing, then under current imperial law, I know what the law says. Then you understand that the council's position is, I understand what the council's position will be, Vaelor said. I'm telling you that position is not the position we'll be taking. He looked around the table, not with aggression, but with the specific quality of attention that made it clear he was gauging something beyond the surface of their reactions. The Covenant wants this boy because of what his bloodline represents, not as a legal problem, but as a weapon. They've been building toward this for 2 years. If they acquire him, the consequence is not a political inconvenience. It's a fundamental shift in the continental balance of power. And if we keep him, Kress asked, the same shift, but in our favor. Kress was quiet for a moment. He was running numbers. Vaelor could see it, the mechanical precision of a military mind processing tactical geometry. You're proposing we shelter a child who, legally, should not exist, Kress said, against the organized pressure of a fanatical order with established infiltration networks in this city, while managing the political fallout of every noble family who will view the child's bloodline as an existential threat to the hierarchy they've spent generations building. Yes, Vaelor said. And the mother? She stays. Another quality of silence. Draveth cleared his throat. The council will need to be briefed. The wider council, not just this room. You understand that once that briefing happens, there is no... I know, Vaelor said. Schedule it for tomorrow. Today, I need the East Wing sealed and the intelligence team on the Covenant's infiltration network in the city. Alden, I want every name you have, every suspected asset, every unconfirmed lead. We start moving on those today. Alden nodded, but his eyes were calculating. And if the council doesn't agree, he said carefully. Vaelor looked at him. The council advises, Vaelor said. It doesn't decide. He stood, and the room stood with him, and he left them to absorb the difference between those two things in a room specifically designed to make the weight of institutions feel absolute. He found Seraphine in the East Wing sitting room 3 hours later. She was at the window, standing, not sitting, standing the way she did everything, with that spine-straight posture of a person who has learned that stillness and collapse feel similar from the outside and has decided to be very deliberate about which one she presents. The room was generous by any measure, high-ceilinged and warmly lit, with a fire going in the stone hearth and a breakfast tray on the table that appeared to have been eaten with the efficiency of someone who treats food as fuel rather than pleasure. Kaelin was on the floor near the hearth with a piece of charcoal and a blank parchment, drawing something with the focused seriousness of a child who is not drawing for an audience. "How was the council?" Seraphine asked. She didn't turn from the window. "About what I expected." Meaning they want him gone. Meaning they understand the strategic value of keeping him and are uncomfortable with it. He moved into the room, not close, keeping the table between them. Not out of wariness, but because she was the kind of person who noticed when space was not given to her and cataloged it. There's a difference between not wanting something to exist and being willing to discard a strategic asset. She turned then and looked at him with those gray eyes that had been assessing him since the creek. "He's not an asset," she said. "No," Vaelor said. "He's not. I know that. But until the people in that room know it too, letting them think of him as one keeps him alive." A silence. "That's a very pragmatic way to protect a child," she said. "I'm a pragmatic person." "Are you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of pending evaluation. He pulled out the chair nearest the table and sat, which was a deliberate choice. The choice to be lower than standing, to remove the height differential, to indicate without saying it that he was not here to perform authority at her. She watched him do it. He had the impression she noticed everything. "I need to ask you something," he said. "You're going to ask me about his father," she said. "Yes." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but in the way of a person who has learned that folding their hands keeps them from doing the work that would otherwise keep them occupied during conversations they'd rather not have. She looked at him steadily. "What do you want to know that isn't already in your intelligence files?" "Whether you understood what was at risk," he said, "at the time. Whether you knew what the bloodline combination would mean if it resulted in a child." Something passed through her face. "I was 23 years old," she said. "I was alone in a Covenant-adjacent camp being used as a translation resource by an empire that didn't bother to ask my opinion about the assignment. His father was—" She paused, and in the pause was the entire weight of something that had been carried for 7 years and did not get lighter with time. "He was someone who treated me like a person. That was the full extent of my political calculation." She said it without apology. That was the part that landed hardest. Not the statement itself, but the absence of apology in it. The clean, undefended acknowledgement of a choice made from the most human possible set of reasons. "When did you know what he was?" Vaelor asked. "When he was 4 months old and I put him down in a snowfield in the middle of a blizzard because I had to." Her voice was level. "And the snow around him melted." From near the hearth, without looking up from his drawing, Kaelin said, "You don't have to tell him all of it." Seraphine looked at her son. The look contained something complicated and precise. The love of a mother who raised a child in a forest and taught him that vigilance was a survival skill and is now watching that vigilance operate in a context it was never designed for. "I know," she said. "I'm just saying." "I know, Kaelin." The boy went back to drawing. Vaelor looked at this drawing. It was only partially visible from his angle. Charcoal marks on parchment, the rough shapes of figures he couldn't fully resolve into an image. He looked away. "The council will push for a formal declaration of his status," Vaelor said, returning to Seraphine. "They'll want him officially registered as a ward of the Empire. It gives them a legal framework and it gives them the illusion of control." "And you?" "I'll agree to the registration." He watched her face. "And I'll make sure the registration classifies him as protected under royal decree, which means no action can be taken against him without my direct authorization." She was very quiet. "You've thought about this," she said. "I've thought about very little else since the report landed on my table 4 days ago." "Why?" She asked it directly. Not as a challenge, but as a genuine question. And that directness had a quality of its own kind of courage in it. the willingness to ask the question, the answer to which might tell her something she wasn't ready for. Vaelor thought about how to answer that. There is a particular kind of question that a person who has spent years managing others' perception of them finds genuinely difficult, not because they don't know the answer, but because the answer is true in a way that bypasses management entirely. He had built a career and an empire on the principle of knowing exactly what he wanted to communicate and communicating precisely that. The architecture of his authority rested on that precision. Because I have spent 15 years building something that I believed would be worth the cost of what it took to build it, he said, and for 15 years I have been very good at not examining the cost too closely. He paused. That boy in there is the cost. Not the only cost, but a significant one, and I am not willing to bury it again. Silence. The fire crackled. From near the hearth, very quietly, Kaelin said nothing, but he had stopped drawing. "You're going to have enemies," Seraphine said finally. "Not just the Covenant, people inside this palace, people who have built their entire position on the hierarchy your laws established. I know. They'll come for him. They'll try." "That's not reassurance." "No," he said. "It's not. I'm not going to insult you by pretending I can guarantee his safety. What I can tell you is that I will spend whatever I have to spend to give that guarantee the best possible chance of being real." She looked at him for a long time. "All right," she said. It was 2 words. It contained a universe of reservation and conditional trust and the specific held-breath quality of a person stepping onto ice and deciding, on the basis of imperfect information, that it will probably hold. He accepted it for what it was. The Covenant made its next move 4 days later. It arrived not in the form of robed figures in forest paths, but in a morning report from Alden, delivered in the quiet efficiency of a man who has learned to break bad news the way a surgeon makes an incision. Quickly, cleanly, with the intention of limiting damage in the excision. "We've identified 2 Covenant assets inside the palace," Alden said, "a junior records clerk in the administrative wing, and a serving woman in the 3rd-floor domestic staff." Vaelor looked up from the report on his desk. "Confirmed?" "Their message traffic in the last 6 days aligns with Covenant codes from the intercepted courier. Both of them sent dispatches after the arrival of the woman and the child." "Describing what?" "The rooms, the guard rotation, the child's approximate schedule." A pause. "And the fact that you have been visiting the East Wing every evening." Vaelor set the report down. "Bring them in," he said, quietly, no public detention. "I want the information on who they report to before anything else." "There's more," Alden said. His voice had shifted slightly. Vaelor recognized the shift. It was the particular register a man's voice takes when the next piece of information is the one that changes the shape of the whole picture. 3 days ago, an invitation was sent from the House of Duskville to every senior noble family in the capital, Alden said. "A formal gathering, tonight." He placed a second document on the desk. "The stated purpose is to discuss the Empire's position on bloodline protections in light of, and I'm quoting the invitation directly, recent developments that threaten the foundational stability of our civilization." Vaelor picked up the document. Empress Morvana Duskville had been a fixed feature of the imperial court for 20 years. She was one of the oldest noble titles in the Empire, a woman of remarkable intelligence and considerable political skill who had navigated 4 regime changes with her house intact and her influence growing. She was also one of the most visible advocates for the ancient bloodline laws, not loudly, not in the inflammatory way of a demagogue, but consistently, with the quiet persistence of someone who understood that political positions maintained over decades outlast the louder ones. He had always found her useful. He was revising that assessment in real time. "The gathering tonight," he said. "How many families have confirmed?" 14, including General Cress's in-laws and 2 of Dravith's closest allies. Vaelor was quiet for a moment. This was a different kind of threat than robed figures in a forest. Forest threats were direct. They had a clear location, a clear intention, and a clear method of response. What Duskville was building was something older and more durable, the kind of threat that didn't need to attack because it could simply consolidate enough weight that the object of its attention collapsed under the accumulation of pressure. She was building a coalition, and she was doing it inside his own palace network, using his own noble structure, with the patient efficiency of someone who had been planning this for considerably longer than 4 days. "We're not going to the gathering," Vaelor said. "No," Alden said, "but we need to know what's said there. Put someone in, not a palace asset. Use a private contractor Duskville's people won't recognize. I want a verbatim account of everything said." He stood, moving to the window, looking out at the city below. Moonspire in daylight was extraordinary, the silver stone of the mountains catching the light and breaking it into 1,000 prismatic fragments. The streets below busy with the ordinary movement of a functioning civilization. Merchants, craftsmen, the slow daily commerce of people living lives that had been made possible by the Empire's stability. "And I want the 2 Covenant assets detained tonight, after the gathering. When they report to their contacts that the palace security has been identified and is responding, I want that information to go back to Duskville's people at a time and in a form I control." Alden absorbed this. "You want her to know we know." "I want her to know we're watching," Vaelor said. "There's a difference." He turned from the window. "And Alden, find out if she has any direct connection to the Covenant, not circumstantial, direct. Meeting records, financial transfers, correspondence, whatever you can find. If she does, then she's not a political problem," Vaelor said. "She's something else entirely." He went to the East Wing that evening. This was, he had been made aware by Alden's report, a pattern that had already been identified and noted by enemy intelligence, which meant he was walking into a situation where his personal movements were being tracked and used. The rational response to that information was to alter the pattern. He didn't alter it. There was a version of the thinking that framed this as tactical. Maintain routine, project confidence, don't let the enemy dictate your behavior. That version wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't the primary reason, and he was trying to be honest with himself about that. The primary reason was that the East Wing was the only place in the palace where the weight of the institution lifted slightly, where the conversations were direct rather than performed, where a boy who could make snow melt drew things with charcoal and asked questions without the qualifiers that every other person in this city attached to their questions when they were directed at the king. He knocked. Seraphine opened the door. She looked at him for a moment, in the way she had of looking at him before she decided what version of the conversation they were about to have. "You look like something happened," she said. "Something has been happening for a while," he said. "I'm just more aware of the shape of it now." She stepped back to let him in. Kaelin was at the window this time, looking down at the city with that particular quality of attention he brought to everything. Not the excited attention of a child discovering something new, but the careful attention of a child cataloging something he is trying to understand. "It's very loud," Kaelin said, not turning. "Cities are," Vaelor said. "Not loud like sound. Loud like—" The boy paused, searching for the word. "Like everyone is feeling things at the same time, and it presses together." He meant it literally, Vaelor realized. He was feeling the emotional density of 40,000 people living within a mile radius. He had probably never been in proximity to more than a dozen people for his entire life. "Does it hurt?" Vaelor asked. Kaelin considered this with the seriousness he brought to honest questions. "It's like the frequency in the forest," he said, "but bigger and less angry." Vaelor sat down at the table. Seraphine poured water from the pitcher without being asked. The casual domestic gesture of someone who has accepted without ceremony that a person will be sitting at her table for the foreseeable future. "Tell me what happened," she said. So he told her. About Alden's report, the assets, the gathering, about Duskvale. He told it straightforwardly, without managing the information for her, which was different from how he typically briefed people. He had realized at some point in the past 4 days that managing information for Seraphine was not a strategy. It was an insult. And she was not a person who responded well to being insulted. She listened with her hands flat on the table, still, attentive. When he finished, she said, "She's been inside this from the beginning. That's my reading, and your council doesn't know. Drevith and Cress are in rooms she's likely been able to access for years. Until I have something definitive, I can't brief them. If one of them is a willing participant, then briefing them warns her." "Yes," she looked at him. "So you're briefing me instead. You're not in her network," he said. "You have no existing loyalty to any structure she can leverage. and you have a better reason than anyone in this palace to want her stopped." "He's my son," she said simply. "Yes," he said. A different kind of silence. Kaelin had turned from the window and was looking at both of them with those amber-rimmed eyes. And whatever calculation was happening behind them was producing an expression Vaelor couldn't fully read, something between assessment and something more complicated that he was too young to have and was carrying anyway, because his life had required it. "The woman from the gathering," Kaelin said. "Duskveil." "You know who she is?" Vaelor asked. "I heard the name when we came through the gate." He looked at Vaelor steadily. "She was at the gate. She was watching when we arrived." Vaelor went still. He looked at Seraphine. She was looking at her son with an expression that was equal parts pride and something that had no clean name, the specific fear of a mother watching her child carry knowledge he should not have to carry. "You saw her?" Vaelor said. "I felt her," Kaelin said. "The same way I felt the Covenant soldiers in the forest. Not the same thing exactly, but the same kind of layer." He paused. "She was happy when she saw us arrive." Vaelor stood slowly. The implications of that statement were settling into the room the way cold settles into a space, gradually, thoroughly, reaching every corner. Duskveil had been at the gate. She had seen them arrive. She had been happy. She hadn't been surprised. She had been happy because it had gone according to a plan she already had, which meant the Covenant's operation in the forest, the 60 soldiers, the frequency anchor, none of it had been designed to take the child. It had been designed to drive them here, into the city, into the palace, into her territory. He had not extracted Kaelin from danger. He had walked him directly into the center of it. "We need to move," he said. "Tonight, before—" The door to the East Wing sitting room opened. Draveth stood in the threshold, and behind him were 4 soldiers in palace livery, and behind them in the corridor were more soldiers, their armor bearing a crest that was not the royal crest, but was close enough to it to pass in poor light. Draveth's face was the face of a man who has made a decision he is already certain he will spend the rest of his life regretting. "My king," Draveth said. His voice was hollow. "I am sorry." Vaelor did not reach for his sword. He looked at the soldiers. He looked at Draveth. He looked at Seraphine, who had positioned herself between the door and Kaelin with the automatic, total commitment of a woman for whom that calculation requires no thought at all. "How long?" Vaelor said. Draveth's jaw tightened. "She has my family, my king." The corridor behind the soldiers was lit by crystal lanterns, their blue-white light steady and cold. And in that light, the empire that Vaelor Nightbane had spent 15 years building looked exactly like what it was. A structure built by human hands, held together by human loyalty, and undone by exactly the same. "I see," Vaelor said, and from behind Seraphine very quietly, Kaelin's voice. "Don't let them take me." It was the first time in 4 days that the boy had sounded like a child. Vaelor looked at the door. He looked at 12 soldiers in false livery. He looked at Draveth's hollow face and thought about every decision that had built this moment, layer by layer, each one reasonable in isolation, each one part of a structure someone else had been building from a different set of blueprints. He thought about the creek. He thought about a woman who had told him she would burn everything he'd built. He thought about a boy whose hand had lit up amber gold in the dark of the Thorn Vale, who had counted 70 soldiers by feeling them, who had melted snow before he could walk. His hand moved to his sword. "No," he said, and the room went very still. His hand was on the sword hilt, and the corridor was full of soldiers, and Draveth was standing in the threshold, looking like a man who had already died and was simply waiting for his body to understand the news. Vaelor did not draw, not yet. There is a particular arithmetic that commanders learn early, usually in the first engagement where the numbers are genuinely wrong. When the enemy has the position, the numbers, and the terrain, and the only variable still in play is the decision made in the next 3 seconds. Bad commanders draw and charge and die with their principles intact. Good commanders stand absolutely still and count the variables they still control. 12 soldiers in the doorway. More in the corridor by Cien. He could hear them without seeing them, the soft layered sound of armored people maintaining formation. The crest on their livery was close to royal, close enough to pass in dim light in crisis, which meant Duskville had resources deep enough to commission convincing forgeries and loyal enough to wear them into a king's private wing. He counted what he had. One sword. One hand. Holt was somewhere in the palace, but not this corridor. Seraphine was behind him, between the soldiers and the boy, with a knife at her hip and the stillness of a person who has already made her decision and is waiting on his. Kaelin was behind Seraphine. That was the number that mattered. "Close the door, Draveth," Vaelor said. Draveth blinked. "My king, close it. Come in. Sit down." His voice carried no heat. It was the voice he used in war councils when the situation was worst. The quieter it got, the worse the situation, and the men around him had learned to fear that voice more than his anger. "If you're going to betray me, at least do it in a room where I can hear your reasoning." The soldiers in the doorway looked at each other. They had been given a script, and the king had gone off it, and the specific discomfort of men following orders when the target of those orders is not behaving as the orders anticipated was visible in the fractional loosening of their formation. Draveth stepped inside. He gestured to the soldiers, a small, pained gesture, the gesture of a man canceling something he wished he'd never started. And they drew back into the corridor. The door closed. The four of them stood in the sitting room, the fire still burning at the hearth, the water pitcher still on the table, the ordinary furniture of a life temporarily borrowed, making the scene look absurd by contrast. Draveth sat. He sat the way people sit when their bones have gone soft, carefully, as if they're not sure the chair will hold them. He was a man of 60, with the fine-boned, precise face of someone who had spent his career among documents and strategies rather than physical confrontation, and right now he looked every year of that age and several additional ones that didn't belong to him. "She has my daughter," he said. Vaelor stood across the table from him. He did not sit. "When did they take her?" 3 days ago. A woman came to my household at night. She left a message and a piece of my daughter's hair." His hands were flat on the table, pressing down, as if keeping them still required active effort. The message said she would be returned when the child and the woman were in covenant custody. "And you decided to comply rather than come to me." "I decided—" Draveth stopped. He looked at the table. "I decided that my daughter's life was worth more to me than my loyalty to a king who brought an impossible problem into this palace and expected his advisors to absorb the consequences." The room was very quiet. Seraphine had not moved from her position near the window. Kaelin was behind her, sitting now, his back against the wall, his eyes open and focused on something nobody else in the room could see. The amber in his irises had that particular brightness that Vaelor had come to recognize as the boy using whatever he used when the world required it. "How long has she been planning this?" Vaelor asked. Draveth looked up. "Morvana?" "Yes." A pause. "Years," Draveth said. "Not the specific operation. She couldn't have known the child existed, not until your scouts found him. But the broader architecture, the coalition, the positions, the assets she placed inside the palace." He paused again, and something in his face shifted toward the particular expression of a man who has been carrying information he didn't want to carry and has finally run out of reasons to keep holding it. "She placed me 2 years ago. Not with threats then, with money and favors and the very reasonable suggestion that the Empire's trajectory was unsustainable and that a man of my intelligence should be considering where he placed his investments. Ospen Machman." "And you accepted?" "I accepted her reasoning," Draveth said. "I told myself there was a difference." There wasn't a difference. They both knew that. The naming of the distinction was the thing people did when they needed the distance between one choice and the thing that choice actually was. Vaelor thought about 15 years. He thought about what it took to build an institution, not the military campaigns, not the consolidation of territories, but the slower, harder work of persuading people to believe in something larger than their own immediate interest. The work of cultivating loyalty across decades, through bad harvests and contested borders, and the ordinary tedium of governance that never made it into the histories but constituted the actual substance of what held a civilization together. He had spent those 15 years doing that work, and the man sitting across the table had been one of the people he'd trusted to help him do it. The cost of trust was exactly this. The moment when you discovered how much of what you'd built was resting on foundations you'd never actually inspected. "Where is your daughter now?" Vaelor said. Draveth's throat moved. I don't know. That's the truth. I was told she would be transferred to a safe location once you delivered us. A silence. Yes, Draveth said. And you believe she will be released? Draveth's hands pressed harder against the table. I believe, he said, that I had no other option that preserved her life. Vaelor looked at him for a long time. The cruelest thing about betrayal of this specific kind, the kind that comes from a genuine corner, from the impossible mathematics of a person forced to choose between one love and another, is that it does not resolve cleanly into villain and victim. Draveth was not a man who had decided his own advancement was worth a child's safety. He was a man who had decided his daughter's life was worth more than a stranger child's, and the mathematics of that calculation were human in the worst, most understandable way. That understanding changed nothing. It also refused to disappear. There's a thing that happens to men who lead long enough. A gradual, necessary erosion of a certain kind of innocence. Not the innocence of youth, which is just inexperience wearing a pleasant face, but a deeper innocence. The belief that people, given sufficient reason, will consistently choose the larger good over the immediate personal one. Every leader arrives at power with some version of that belief. Every leader, given enough time and enough betrayals, watches it dissolve. The ones who survive are the ones who manage to function anyway, who build systems that account for the failure of individuals rather than relying on the impossible consistency of human virtue. Vaelor had built such systems. They had not been sufficient. Kaelin, Vaelor said. The boy looked at him. The soldiers in the corridor, how many, and what's their state? Kaelin was quiet for a moment, that slight unfocused quality to his eyes as he reached outward with whatever he used. 9. They're uneasy. The one at the far end is afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid they went too far. A pause. The one closest to the door is thinking about leaving. Seraphine said nothing, but her hand moved to the knife at her hip and then moved away again. The motion of someone reminding themselves of a decision they'd already made. Draveth, Vaelor said, you're going to go back out into that corridor. Draveth looked up sharply. You're going to tell the soldiers that the operation has changed, that Morvana wants the transfer at the Western Gate instead of here. You're going to do this convincingly enough that they leave this wing. And if they don't believe me, then we do this the harder way, Vaelor said. But I would prefer the version that doesn't require the harder way. And my daughter? Vaelor looked at him squarely. I will find her. That is not a promise I make to make you compliant. It is a statement of what I will do regardless of what happens in this room tonight, because she is an innocent person being used as a lever by someone who does not deserve to use people that way. He let that land. But I need you to decide right now whether you're going to help me or whether everything we've spent 15 years building is going to end in this sitting room. The fire crackled. Draveth's hand slowly lifted from the table. He stood. He straightened his coat with the particular precision of a man restoring some external version of himself because the internal version was not available for presentation. All right, he said. He went to the door. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that compress in memory and expand in the body, the kind that leave marks not as narrative but as tension in the shoulders and a specific quality of alertness that doesn't fully release for days afterward. Draveth's misdirection bought them 20 minutes. They used the servant passages. Vaelor knew them the way he knew the palace's structural weak points, the way any serious commander knows the secondary routes of a fortification he intends to hold. Seraphine moved through the narrow stone corridors with the efficiency of someone who had spent 7 years navigating by necessity rather than comfort, her hand tight around Kaelin's wrist, her footsteps making almost no sound on the old stone. Vaelor took them to the undercroft. It was the oldest part of the palace, predating the current structure by several centuries, and it had the particular quality of old construction, low-ceilinged, damp at the edges, lit by iron wall brackets that held oil rather than crystal, smelling of stone and time. It was also the one part of the palace that Duskville's network was least likely to have fully mapped, because it required knowing the building's history rather than its current configuration. Holt was waiting. He had that look on his face, the look of a man who had received partial information and constructed a complete picture from it that he did not entirely enjoy. How bad? He said. Dravith was compromised, Vaelor said. The soldiers in the East Wing corridor are Duskavail's people. She has an asset network in the palace that we've been operating inside without knowing it for at least 2 years. Holt absorbed this with the flat efficiency of a soldier receiving casualty reports. The gathering tonight? Yes. 14 families. Likely more by now. Vaelor moved to the rough table at the center of the undercroft and looked at the map Holt had already laid out. The palace grounds, the city approaches, the district layouts. She wanted them here, in the capital. She designed the forest operation to drive us here. Why? Because out there, in the Thornvale, I control the terrain. Here, he pressed a finger against the map at the palace's position, in the center of the city, surrounded by the city's entire social and political architecture. Here she has 60 years of positioning. Here she has families, networks, favors owed, assets placed. Here the boy is not an anomaly in a forest that nobody owns. Here he is a political object in a city that runs on political objects. Holt looked at the map. She wants to put him in front of the council. She wants to force me to put him in front of the council. In a context she controls, with 14 noble families already aligned against him and a legal case that the current laws make very easy to make. He straightened. If she can get a council declaration against him, she doesn't need soldiers. The law does the work. Seraphine was listening from across the undercroft, her back against the stone wall, Kaelin beside her. When Vaelor finished, she said, "Then you need to move before she calls the council." "The council session is at dawn," Holt said. "Dravith was supposed to have us in Covenant custody by midnight. When that doesn't happen, she'll move the timeline. How long do we have? Hours? Maybe less." Seraphine pushed off the wall. "Then stop planning and start doing." There was a quality to her voice that Vaelor recognized, the voice of someone who has spent 7 years making decisions in the span of seconds with no council and no staff and no institutional support, and who has very limited patience for the organizational machinery that replaces that speed with process. She was not wrong. She was also not entirely right. But the thing about her was that even when she was being impatient in a direction that pointed toward the correct next action, which was more than could be said for most of the advisors he'd spent 15 years working with. "I need to reach General Kress directly," Vaelor said, "not through any channel Duskvail's network might have access to. Personally, tonight." "His in-laws are at the gathering," Holt said. "His in-laws, not him." Vaelor looked at Holt. "Kress has served under 4 kings. He has never been to a gathering organized by a noble house without a royal invitation. I know the man. He's uncomfortable, he's suspicious, and he is currently sitting in his private study trying to decide what the right move is." Holt considered this. "You could be wrong." "I could be." Vaelor held his gaze. "Am I?" A pause. "No," Holt said. He went. In the undercroft silence that followed, Vaelor sat on the edge of the rough table and looked at the map and tried to see the shape of it. Not the individual pieces, but the structure. The way an architect looks at a building and reads not just the walls, but the intention behind them. Duskvail had been patient. That was the part that mattered most. Not her resources or her network or even the specificity of her plan. Patience was the thing that separated maneuvering from statecraft, and what she had done was statecraft. She had spent decades inserting herself into positions from which she could observe and influence without being the visible actor. And when the variable she'd been waiting for finally appeared, a child with an impossible bloodline, a king who brought him into the capital rather than eliminating him, she had moved with the precision of someone whose plan had already accounted for most of the possible responses. The one thing she hadn't accounted for, probably, was that Vaelor would find out about the gathering so quickly, or that the boy could feel her presence at the gate. That thought settled into him differently than the others. She had been there. She had been watching. She had been happy. He turned it over. What did it mean that she was happy? Not satisfied. Happy. The particular quality of emotion Kaelin had described was not the cold satisfaction of a strategist watching a plan execute. It was something warmer, more personal. He looked at Kaelin, who was sitting against the far wall with his knees drawn up, doing that thing he did. That internal listening, that reaching outward with whatever sense operated alongside his normal senses. The boy's eyes were open but not present, focused on something interior. "Kaelin," Vaelor said. The boy looked at him. "At the gate. When you felt her, did you feel anything else? Anything specific about what she was feeling?" Kaelin was quiet for a moment, working backward through a memory in the specific way of a person whose memories are stored in sensation rather than narrative. "She was looking at you," he said finally. "Not at me. At you." Seraphine, who had been standing near the stone wall with her arms crossed, and her expression doing the thing it did when she was listening to two conversations simultaneously, the one in the room and the one happening in her own analysis, went very still. "She's not just after Kaelin," Seraphine said. "No," Vaelor said. "She wants to destroy you. She wants to destroy what I represent. The consolidation. The empire built on any principle other than bloodline supremacy." He paused. "The boy is the mechanism, but I'm the target." The fire in the wall bracket sputtered. In the Undercroft's low, damp silence, a realization settled. Not sudden, but cumulative, the way a room's temperature changes when too many people have been in it for too long. This was not a political challenge. This was not even a coup in the conventional sense, a seizure of power by a competing faction with competing interests. What Duskvale had built was something older and more absolute, the reassertion of a worldview that the Empire had been, under Vaelor's rule, systematically dismantling. She was not trying to take his throne. She was trying to invalidate the premise on which his throne stood. The difference between those two things was enormous. A man fighting for his throne fights to preserve his position. A man fighting for the premise of his throne fights for the validity of every choice that built it, every law abolished, every exile welcomed back, every bloodline protection extended to people who had never been extended protections before. Losing the first fight cost him a crown. Losing the second cost everyone who had built a life on the assumption that the Empire had changed. "She's going to move tonight," he said. "She knows the transfer failed. When her assets in the corridor report back that Dreveth rerouted them, she'll stop waiting for a cleaner option." "What will she do?" Seraphine asked. "She'll call an emergency council session. Use the gathering as a pre-formed consensus block. Come in with 14 families' vocal support and a legal argument that's been years in preparation." He looked at the map. "If she gets that session before I can position Cress and the military, she can call for an imperial tribunal. Under existing law, the tribunal supersedes royal decree on questions of bloodline integrity." "And you couldn't stop it?" "Not without dissolving the council, which requires—" He stopped. Seraphine looked at him. "What?" she said. "It requires a declaration of emergency governance," he said slowly, "which requires a formal threat to imperial stability, which I cannot make unilaterally without triggering exactly the political crisis she wants." He paused. "Unless the threat is physical, an active attack on the capital." "You'd need proof of one," Seraphine said. "I'd need proof of Covenant involvement in the palace. Actual proof, not intelligence reports, not intercepted couriers. Something that makes the threat undeniable in front of every noble family in that gathering." He looked at the map again. "Something that forces them to choose between Duskvale's vision and their own survival." The Undercroft door opened. Holt came through it. Behind him, slightly out of breath and wearing the coat of a man who had left his house quickly, was General Cress. He looked at Vaelor. He looked at Seraphine. He looked at Kaelin against the wall, his jaw set. "I left the gathering an hour ago," he said. "I want to know what's happening in my city." And just as Vaelor opened his mouth to answer, just as the pieces of a viable response were assembling themselves from the available resources, and the specific shape of Cress's presence here suggested that the foundation was not as completely eroded as it had seemed 20 minutes ago. The boy made a sound, not words, a sharp exhale, sudden and involuntary, the kind that precedes pain. Everyone turned. Kaelin had both hands pressed flat against the stone floor, and the light was back. Not the controlled ember-warm glow of before, but something different. Something that filled the Undercroft in a single pulse, amber gold and shaking, and then went out. His face was white. "Kaelin." Seraphine was across the room in 4 steps, her hands on his face, turning it toward her. "What happened?" "Something came through the bond," he said. His voice was strange, stripped of its usual steadiness, scraped thin. Something attached to it from outside. He looked at her, and his eyes were wrong. The amber still bright, but surrounded now by a fine, dark tracery at the edges. Hairline cracks in the iris, spreading outward from the pupils like fractures in ice. "Mom, I see it," she said. She was already checking his hands, his arms, her face doing the specific controlled thing it did when she was frightened and refusing to perform it. She looked at Vaelor over the boy's head. Her eyes told him everything the controlled face wasn't saying. "What is that?" Cress said. "A curse," Vaelor said. The word landed in the undercroft like something dropped from a height, because the boy was still upright, still conscious. But the dark tracery at the edges of his eyes was spreading, slow and deliberate, and the specific quality of its movement, patient, purposeful, like ink dropped in water finding its way to every available surface, was the movement of something that had been designed to complete itself. He had been within reach of Covenant soldiers twice in the last 12 hours. The anchor in the forest, the soldiers in the corridor. One of them had done this. Done it subtly enough that neither he nor Seraphine had seen it happen, which meant it had been designed not to be seen, designed to wait until the subject was in a location where intervention would be difficult. The middle of a palace under political siege, the middle of a crisis deliberately constructed to consume every available resource and attention. Duskvale had not needed the transfer to succeed. She had only needed Kaelin close enough for long enough. She knew, Vaelor said. It came out of him with the flat, cold quality of a realization that has completed itself before the words catch up. The whole operation, the forest, the extraction, bringing us here. She never needed us to stay. She needed us to be here long enough for the curse to be placed. Cress was staring at the boy. Can it be reversed? The Imperial healers might... No, Seraphine said. She was still holding Kaelin's face, still looking at the tracery. Her voice was steady in the specific way of a woman who will not allow herself to be anything other than steady when her child needs her to be. Not the healers. This is covenant work, old work. It doesn't respond to... I know what responds to it, Vaelor said. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Kaelin, at the dark lines spreading from the edges of the boy's eyes, patient and certain. He was also looking at the decision forming in front of him, the one that had been building since the creek, since the first report, since he had stood in a war room alone at night and felt the sealed room inside his chest rattle for the first time in 15 years. It had been forming itself from everything he'd done and not done and refused to name, and now it was here, and it was in the shape of a choice that could not be undone. The Moonstone relic. It was in the vault beneath the throne room. He had not looked at it in a decade. He had not spoken its name in longer. The ritual it enabled was not forbidden by imperial law because nobody alive knew it existed. It had been sealed from the public record by his predecessor's predecessor, 3 generations back, at the conclusion of a war that nobody living remembered, and the histories described only obliquely. What he knew about it, he knew from a document he had read once and destroyed, because the knowledge of its existence in the wrong hands was a different kind of threat than the ritual itself. The ritual permanently bound the life force of 2 living beings. Whatever happened to one, happened to both. A curse placed on one would have to pass through both to complete itself. A single thread of power placed against a curse of this kind was insufficient. A doubled thread woven from 2 sources was a different calculation entirely. The Covenant had designed this curse for a child. It had not been designed for a child bound to a king. He had known this option existed since the moment he saw the dark tracery. He had been standing here deciding whether to name it, because naming it meant doing it, and doing it was irreversible in a way that nothing else he had done in 15 years came close to. It meant that his life, and the life of an impossible child, became a single thing. It meant that whatever Duskvale sent against Kaelin would arrive first at Vaelor's own door. It meant that every political calculation, every argument about strategic assets and imperial stability, and the cost-benefit of one child versus an empire, every reason his council would give him for why this was an act of madness, all of it became irrelevant the moment he made the choice. It also meant the boy lived. That was the only arithmetic that mattered. Cress, Vaelor said, I need you to hold this palace until I come back. Nobody enters the throne room. Nobody. Cress looked at him with the flat, measured eyes of a man who has served 4 kings and recognizes the look of a decision being made that cannot be undone. How long? Cress said. Long enough. Vaelor turned to Holt. Whatever you hear from in there, whatever it sounds like, you do not enter. You hold the corridor, and you let me finish. Holt's jaw tightened. And if you don't come out? Vaelor looked at him. Then the boy will, he said. He looked at Seraphine. She was already reading his face. She was always already reading his face. She had the expression she wore when she was calculating something she didn't have full information for and was deciding anyway, which was the expression she'd worn since the creek, and probably for most of the 7 years before that. You're going to bind yourself to him, she said. Yes. If the curse kills him, it won't kill him. That's the point. If the binding fails, then I'll have made the wrong choice, he said. But it won't be the first time, and I've generally found that making the wrong choice in the right direction is less expensive in the long run than making the right choice in the wrong one. She looked at him for a long moment. He's not your son, she said. And there it was, the thing at the center of everything, named plainly at last, in a damp undercroft with a dying fire and an empire fracturing above their heads. Not a challenge, not an accusation, just the statement of the actual fact, stripped of everything that had been building around it for 4 days, placed between them to be looked at clearly. Vaelor looked at it. No, he said. He's not. He picked up his coat from the table. But he's here, he said. And so am I. He walked out of the undercroft, and behind him, in the low stone room, in the breathing silence of people absorbing a decision none of them had been asked to authorize, Kaelin pressed both hands against the floor again, and the light came up one more time. Steadier now, warmer, as if it had recognized something in the room worth holding on to. And above them, somewhere in the palace that Vaelor had built from the wreckage of 15 years of necessary choices, Empress Morvana Duskveil was about to discover that the one variable she had never built into her plan was the possibility that a king who had spent his entire reign choosing empire over everything would, at the precise worst moment for her purposes, choose something else entirely. The throne room vault had not been opened in 11 years. Vaelor knew this because he was the last person to have opened it, and the memory of that day, a gray morning 2 years into his reign, when he had descended alone to inventory everything his predecessor had left behind and found a great deal he wished he hadn't, was one of those memories that lived not in narrative but in the body. The smell of the stone, the specific cold. The way the lamp he'd carried had caught the moonstone's surface and turned it into something that looked less like an object and more like a decision waiting to be made. He descended now with a lamp and no ceremony. Behind him, the palace was conducting itself with the particular controlled chaos of an institution that has discovered a fracture in its foundation and is in the process of deciding whether to address it or collapse. He could hear it in the walls, not literally, but in the way a person who has lived inside a structure for long enough hears its moods through vibration and ambient sound. Cress was holding the upper corridors. Holt was at the throne room door. Dravith was somewhere in the east wing, sitting with the broken posture of a man who had burned his life down and was still waiting to see if anything worthwhile would grow from the ash. None of that mattered for the next few minutes. The vault door was iron, sealed with a mechanism that required both a physical key and a specific sequence of pressure points along the frame. Vaelor had memorized both 11 years ago and not deliberately recalled either since. He found that the body holds what the mind doesn't bother to maintain. His hands went through the sequence without hesitation, the pressure points falling under his fingers with the muscle memory of a thing practiced until it became reflex. And the door opened inward with the deep, slow sound of old iron releasing its position. The cold came out first. He went in. The vault was small, 6 paces by 4, lined in the kind of silver-veined stone that the deeper mountain quarries produced, stone that held temperature the way it held time, which was to say indefinitely. The shelves along the walls held documents in sealed cases and objects wrapped in oilcloth, most of them the accumulated artifacts of 3 previous reigns that he had catalogued and left where they were, because the responsible management of an empire did not include arbitrarily disturbing things better left undisturbed. On the lowest shelf, unwrapped, was the moonstone. It was smaller than the memory made it. It always was. Objects that carry significant weight in a person's reckoning tend to occupy more space in the imagination than they do in physical reality, and the moonstone was no exception. It was roughly the size of a man's closed fist, pale gray-white, with a surface that was neither quite translucent nor quite opaque. It had the quality of deep water seen from above, the sense of depth without the ability to resolve what lay at the bottom. He picked it up. It was warm. That was wrong. The vault was cold enough that his breath had missed it on the way in, and the object had been sitting on a stone shelf in that cold for 11 years. It should have been uniformly cold, the way everything in here was cold. It was warm in his hand. Not dramatically, not uncomfortably. Just warm. The temperature of something living. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he went back up. Kaelin was worse. In the time it had taken Vaelor to descend to the vault, retrieve the stone, and climb back through the palace's underbelly to the throne room's antechamber where Seraphine had moved the boy at Holt's direction, the dark tracery had spread from the edges of Kaelin's eyes to his temples, fine and precise, like the lines of a map overlaid on skin. The boy was upright, still upright, which was its own testimony to whatever constituted his fundamental structure. But the uprightness was costing him. It was visible in the locked quality of his jaw and the careful evenness of his breathing, the specific physical management of a person who has learned that showing their pain is a liability. 7 years old, managing his pain like a soldier. Seraphine was beside him, not touching, respecting whatever internal process was keeping him functional. She looked at Vaelor when he entered, at the stone in his hand, and then at his face, and her expression did the thing it did when she was absorbing information she'd already half prepared herself for. "How does it work?" she said. "The stone amplifies a direct bond between two life forces. The ritual anchors it permanently." He set the stone on the broad arm of the nearest chair and looked at Kaelin. "The curse was designed for a single target. A bound target is not a single target. The curse has to split to reach both, and a split curse against a doubled source loses integrity. It doesn't complete. And if it doesn't complete, it fractures, discharges without resolution. The boy lives. And you?" He didn't answer immediately. It was not a meaningful pause. He was not being evasive, and she was perceptive enough to know the difference between evasion and a man taking the appropriate amount of time with an honest answer. "The discharge will hit the bond's stronger anchor," he said, "which will be me, not him, because I'm older and the bond will orient to established life force over developing life force." He met her eyes. "I'll survive it." "You'll survive it," she repeated. "I've survived worse." "That is a remarkable thing to say about something you've never done before." "I've never lost a war either," he said. "That doesn't make the statement less accurate." She looked at him with those gray eyes that had been seen through the architecture of what people presented since before she had any reason to trust the accuracy of her own perception. She was doing it now. Looking past the operational confidence and the steady voice and the flat competence of a man who had built 15 years of authority on never letting the room see him uncertain. "You're not sure," she said. "No," he said. "I'm not sure." Another kind of silence. The honest ones always landed differently. She looked at the stone. She looked at her son, at the fine dark lines spreading through the skin of his temples. Then she looked back at Vaelor, and what crossed her face was not the surrender of judgment, but its full, clear-eyed application. The expression of a woman running an honest calculation and arriving at the only answer the arithmetic actually produced. "Then do it," she said. He nodded once. He picked up the stone, pulled the nearest chair to where Kaelin was sitting, and sat. He looked at the boy. "I need you to be still," he said. Kaelin looked at him. The amber in his irises was dimmer now. Not absent, but lowered, like a fire in weather. His face was pale beneath the dark lines. He looked, for the first time, genuinely young. Not the compressed, preternatural alertness of the forest child who counted soldiers by feeling them. Just a 7-year-old, frightened, trying very hard not to be. "Is it going to hurt?" Kaelin asked. "Yes," Vaelor said. "Briefly." The boy absorbed this with a small nod. "Okay." Vaelor put the stone between his own palm and the back of the boy's hand. He closed both their hands around it. The warmth intensified immediately, not comfortable now, but insistent. The warmth of something that had been waiting for exactly this configuration and was not inclined to wait any longer. He felt it climb his arm, the stone's heat finding the channels of his own body the way water finds the path of least resistance. running along the inside of his veins like light through a glass tube, reaching his chest, his heart, and settling there with the absolute finality of something that has arrived at its destination. Kalen made a sharp sound. Then the bond snapped into place. It was not metaphorical, it was physical. A sensation of connection so specific and so sudden that it reorganized the entire interior landscape of the moment. He felt the boy's life force the way you feel the presence of a fire in a dark room. Not just warmth, but orientation. The specific quality of aliveness that belongs to one particular living thing and no other. The curse was there too. He could feel it now, could feel the shape of it, cold and deliberate where the bond was warm and instinctive, a foreign architecture built inside a living system with the intent of shutting it down. He pulled. This was the part that was not in the document he had read and destroyed. The document had described the ritual mechanics, but not the experience of it, because the person who wrote it had been a scholar rather than a practitioner and had known the theory without the reality. The reality was that disrupting an active curse by drawing it through a bond required the same quality of sustained effort as holding a door against something very strong that wanted to come through it. Not a single exertion, but continuous, committed pressure, the kind of physical and cognitive engagement that ate through reserves quickly and could not be interrupted once begun. He held it. The discharge came in 3 waves. The first was manageable, a sharp, cold pressure behind the eyes, like the leading edge of a migraine, but concentrated, purposeful. He registered it and kept his grip on the stone and kept pulling. The second wave was worse, a sensation of something tearing at the inner structure of his chest, not his heart, but the space around it, the place where the bond had anchored itself, the curse attacking the connection point, because the connection point was what stood between it and its target. He heard himself exhale through his teeth, a rough sound, involuntary. His hand tightened around Kalen's. The boy was very still. The third wave was not like the first 2. The third wave was the curse recognizing that it had lost and making a final total effort before dissolution, the way a fire doubles in intensity when you try to smother it before it goes out. It hit the bond with everything it had, cold and absolute, and for approximately 4 seconds, Vaelor experienced something that had no clean description in any language. The sensation of his own life force standing directly in the path of a force designed to end a life, absorbing the impact, holding. Then it broke. The discharge released in a single pulse, amber gold and cold simultaneously, the 2 energies canceling each other, the vault of the throne room filling with light that existed for approximately 2 seconds and then was gone as completely as if it had never been. Silence. Vaelor was still in the chair. His right hand was still holding the stone. His left hand was still holding the boy's. He became aware incrementally of the following: his own heartbeat, which was present and real, the cold stone floor under his boots, Seraphine's breath, audible from 2 feet away, and the boy's hand in his, which was warm, just warm, no longer the chill that the curse had been building into it, just the ordinary warmth of a living child's hand. He looked at Kalen. The dark lines were gone. The amber in the boy's eyes was back, fully, brightly, the color of banked fire. And Kalen was staring at Vaelor with an expression that was not the assessment look he usually wore. It was something else, something that had no armor around it at all. "It worked," Kalen said. "Yes," Vaelor said. "You're bleeding." He looked at his left hand. He was. A thin line from the base of his palm to the wrist, where the curse's final wave had found the only surface it could reach. Not serious. He closed his hand around it. "I'm fine," he said. Seraphine was already there. She had a strip of cloth from somewhere. What? She was always prepared. It was one of the things about her that he had stopped finding surprising. And she took his hand without asking and wrapped it with the focused efficiency of someone who has dressed wounds in conditions considerably worse than a throne room antechamber. Her hands were steady. Her face was not, quite. She tied the wrap and held his hand for a moment, just held it, not with sentiment, but with something that was the honest acknowledgement of what had just happened in the room, the thing that did not need to be spoken because speaking it would require a precision that the moment didn't have space for yet. Then she let go. "We need to move," she said. She was right. He stood. The standing cost him something, not catastrophically, but enough to notice the specific depletion of a person who has just spent a significant portion of their available reserves in a single sustained effort. He filed the information and continued to stand. Outside the throne room, the palace was no longer conducting its controlled chaos. Outside, the palace was on fire, Mads. Not literally. Not yet. But when Holt threw open the door at the sound of Vaelor's footstep in the corridor, his face told the story before his words did. The story of a situation that had moved from difficult to something that required a different category of response. Duskville moved, Holt said. She didn't wait for dawn. She called the council session an hour ago in the West Hall, with her 14 families as witnesses. Cress's people held the main council chamber, but she bypassed it, used the Duskvale family's residential hall as alternate venue, which is technically on imperial grounds. He stopped. She has an imperial seal. We don't know how she got it. What did the session produce? A declaration. Holt's jaw was tight. Formal declaration that the Empire's foundational stability is under threat from bloodline contamination. She named the child specifically. She called for immediate protective custody under noble authority pending a full tribunal. Vaelor was very still. The architecture of what she had done assembled itself in his mind with the cold clarity of someone reading a trap they have just entered. She had not needed the council chamber. She had not needed the official session protocol. She had the families, she had the seal, she had a documentation of consensus that would hold up under any subsequent legal review as a legitimately convened noble assembly. The location was irregular, but the Empire's law, his law, accounted for irregular convening under emergency circumstances, and she would argue that this was exactly that. She had used his laws against him. That was the elegant cruelty of it. Not her laws, his. The provisions he had built into the system to allow for rapid response in genuine crises, the very legal architecture that represented his belief in governance as a living structure rather than a rigid one, had become the instrument of his undoing. "Where is she now?" Vaelor said. Vaelor shrugged. Moving toward the east wing, Holt's voice was flat. With approximately 30 soldiers, her own retinue, not palace guard. Through what route? The garden corridor. She'll reach the east wing in, Holt calculated, 8 minutes. Vaelor looked at Seraphine. She was already pulling her coat on. "She's not taking him," Seraphine said. It was not a vow or a dramatic declaration. It was a statement of operational fact, delivered with the same tone she used to tell him the forest path was too exposed or the fire needed banking. Just the reality, named plainly. "No," Vaelor said. "She's not." There are moments in the life of a person who has spent years operating inside an institutional framework, making decisions that are strategic rather than instinctive, that pass through layers of counsel and consequence before becoming action, when the framework simply stops being adequate to the situation. When the structure that has governed every choice becomes the thing that cannot produce the necessary next choice. These moments are rare, and they are recognizable, and the quality that separates leaders who survive them from leaders who don't is the willingness to abandon the framework without abandoning the principle underneath it. The principle underneath every decision Vaelor had made in 15 years of building an empire was simple. He had never articulated it cleanly, had rarely articulated it at all, because the articulation of a principle tends to make it brittle, where the practice of it keeps it supple. The principle was this: people deserved a world in which the accident of their birth was not the ceiling of their life. That was it. Everything else, the consolidation, the abolished laws, the welcomed exiles, the protections extended to the unprotected, was that principle in practice under various conditions. Duskville wanted to end that principle. She had built a very good mechanism for doing it, but she had made the same mistake every person who built mechanisms for controlling other people eventually made. She had designed her mechanism for the predictable version of her opponent, the king who operated inside the institution, who used the council and the law and the measured response, who valued the structure because the structure was what he had built. She had not designed for the version of him that had just spent 4 seconds absorbing a death curse so a 7-year-old could keep breathing. "Cress," Vaelor said. The general materialized from the shadow of the corridor. He had been there since Vaelor emerged, standing with the stillness of a man who has been waiting for orders and has made his decision about following them before they are given. "Sir," Cress said, "the declaration she produced is a legal document assembled under emergency provisions. Under imperial law, an emergency declaration can be suspended by the ranking executive authority in the presence of a direct and active threat to the capital. He paused. The Covenant soldiers who entered the palace earlier tonight constitute that threat. I need them formally identified and documented as an active hostile force on imperial grounds. Cress's eyes moved to Holt, brief and efficient. Already have 3 of them in holding, Holt said. Taken from the corridor outside the east wing. Full Covenant insignia under the palace livery. That's your documentation, Vaelor said to Cress. Active hostile infiltration of the imperial palace. Under emergency suspension, every decision made tonight under Duskveil's declaration is stayed until formal review. He met Cress's eyes. Can you hold that position legally if she challenges it? Cress was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I can hold it, he said. Then hold it, and bring those 3 soldiers to the garden corridor. I want them visible when she arrives. He turned to the corridor. Holt fell in at his shoulder without being asked. Seraphine moved to his left, Kaelin between them, and the small, unlikely configuration of people who had ended up on the same side of this night moved through the palace's dim stone passages toward the garden corridor, and the woman walking through it with 30 soldiers and a declaration she believed was unassailable. The garden corridor was aptly named. It ran along the outer edge of the palace's central courtyard, one wall open to the night air and the courtyard's tiered plantings, the other solid stone. Crystal lanterns lined the open side at regular intervals, and at this hour their blue-white light fell across the corridor's stone floor in long, cold parallelograms that made the space look like a passage between 2 different kinds of night. Duskveil was 30 feet in when they entered from the far end. She stopped. She was not what the architecture of her actions had prepared him to expect. He had built a picture from intelligence reports and a lifetime of recognizing particular species of political operators, and the picture had certain features: confidence, control, the smooth surface of someone who has never been caught. The woman who stopped in the garden corridor and looked at him across 30 feet of lantern light had all of those features. And more than that, she had a quality that he had not anticipated and now recognized in the moment of seeing it as the quality that made her genuinely dangerous. She was certain, not confident, certain. The distinction was significant. Confidence was a posture. Certainty was a belief. The belief, deep and total, that the world as she understood it was the world as it was, that her map corresponded to the territory, that she had never been fundamentally wrong about anything that mattered. She looked at Vaelor. She looked at the stone in his coat pocket, which she could not see but which she clearly knew was there. Her eyes went to his right hand and then away, quickly, the involuntary reflex of a person registering unexpected information. She looked at Kaelin. The dark lines were gone from his temples. Her face did not change, but her certainty fractured, infinitesimally, a single hairline crack, invisible except to someone looking specifically for it, which Vaelor was. Vaelor, she said, you look tired. Morvana, he said, this doesn't have to be a confrontation. Her voice was warm. The warmth of it was remarkable, actually. Studied without sounding studied. The warmth of a woman who had spent decades performing reasonableness so consistently that the performance had become indistinguishable from the quality it was imitating. The declaration tonight was not an act of aggression. It was a legal instrument properly assembled with the welfare of the Empire as its sole purpose. You used a stolen seal, Vaelor said. The seal was not stolen. It was lent by a member of the Imperial household. She paused. I'm sure the question of which member will be very interesting to explore at the tribunal. There won't be a tribunal. She tilted her head, the gesture of a woman who finds an interesting argument. The declaration has been suspended, Vaelor said. Active hostile infiltration of the palace grounds by Covenant forces. Cress has documentation. The emergency provisions your declaration used also provide for emergency suspension. We're using them. He let that land. Your instrument cut both ways. Behind her, her 30 soldiers shifted. Not breaking formation, but adjusting. The small collective recalibration of people whose footing has changed. Her warmth did not cool, it deepened. The kind of deepening that was not warmth at all underneath. The increasing pressure of something that had decided reasonableness was no longer useful and was selecting its replacement. You bound yourself to the child, she said. Yes. That was... She stopped. In the pause, something moved through her face that was not calculated and was therefore, briefly, true. That was not something I built into the plan. No, Vaelor said. I imagine it wasn't. It changes nothing operationally. The tribunal will still convene. The law is still the law. The law, Vaelor said, is what I say it is. Because I built it. And because every provision in it was built on a principle that you have spent decades trying to dismantle. And I am done. I am finished. Allowing that dismantling to proceed under the language of the thing it is destroying. Her eyes were steady. His were steadier. There is a particular silence that exists between two people who have been maneuvering around the same center for years and have finally arrived, simultaneously, at a point where the maneuvering is exhausted, and what remains is the unmediated reality of what each of them actually is. That silence existed in the garden corridor between the crystal lanterns under the night sky, with 30 soldiers on one side and 13 on the other, and a boy with amber eyes standing between a king and his mother. You can't protect him forever, Duskveil said. I don't need forever, Vaelor said. I need long enough. She was quiet. Then she looked at Kaelin. Really looked at him, not the strategic assessment she had been performing since before tonight, but an actual look, the kind that happens when a person's constructed framework for understanding something gives way briefly to direct perception. She looked at the boy who had been raised in a forest by a woman alone, who counted soldiers by feeling them, who had spent 4 days in a palace absorbing 40,000 lives worth of ambient emotion, who had held himself still in an undercroft while a curse worked through his temples and managed not to fracture. Something moved in her face. He's just a child, she said. And the something in her face was complicated, genuinely complicated, the expression of a person whose certainty has just encountered a fact that it cannot accommodate without rearranging itself. Yes, Seraphine said. Her voice was the flattest thing in the corridor. He is. Duskveil's jaw moved, and then from behind her 30 soldiers, from 3 different points along the garden corridor's stone walls, came the sound that every person present had been registering at the edge of awareness for several minutes and had been too focused on the immediate confrontation to fully process. Sound from outside the walls. Organized sound. The kind of sound that has a beat to it, that resolves, as you listen, into the rhythm of an army moving. Vaelor looked at Holt. Holt's face was the face of a soldier whose intelligence just updated itself. That's not ours, Holt said. It wasn't Cress's troops. Cress's troops were inside the palace. It wasn't a patrol. Patrols didn't generate that density of movement sound. It was a large force, moving with the organized urgency of a force that has been staged somewhere nearby and has received a signal to advance, and it was moving toward the palace walls from at least 2 directions. Vaelor looked at Duskveil. She was looking at the walls. For the first time that night, her expression was not performing anything at all. It was just present, sharp and taut, and what it contained was not triumph. You didn't call them, he said. It was not a question. This was meant to be handled internally, she said. Then someone escalated without your authorization. Her jaw tightened. The Covenant had not been following Duskveil's plan. They had been using it. The patience she had built into her operation, the decades of positioning, the coalition, the declaration, had been the mechanism the Covenant needed to get its forces close to the capital without triggering the military response that an overt approach would have generated. She had been their cover. She had believed she was using them. The sound of the army grew. In the garden corridor between 2 groups of soldiers who had been about to have a confrontation and were now standing in the presence of a much larger and more immediate problem, a new kind of stillness fell. The stillness of people recalculating simultaneously what the next necessary action actually was. Vaelor looked at Cress, who had appeared at the corridor's south entrance with the wordless timing of a general who monitors situations without needing to be summoned. Numbers? Vaelor said. Estimating 400, Cress said. From the east and north. They'll reach the outer wall in... He listened, head slightly tilted, the experienced ear of a man who had spent a career reading the sound of armies. 15 minutes. 400. Against whatever palace guard remained after Duskveil's assets had been removed from the rotation, plus Cress's personnel inside, plus 13 soldiers who had ridden out of the Thornvale 4 days ago and had not slept properly since. The mathematics were not good. Vaelor looked at Kalen. The boy was looking at the walls. The amber in his eyes was bright, brighter than it had been in the Undercroft, brighter than in the forest, the specific brightness of those irises under conditions of elevated external stimulus. His head was tilted at the same angle as Cress's had been, but he was not listening to sound. He was listening to something else. 430, Kalen said, quietly and precisely. And they have the same frequency device, larger. It's already active. I can feel it from here. Vaelor looked at the stone in his coat pocket. The moonstone, warm, the bond it carried settled now into something permanent and present, a steady awareness in his chest that was not his own life, but lived alongside his. He looked at the boy. He looked at the woman who had raised that boy for 7 years in a forest with no help and no margin for error, who was standing 2 feet away from him with her hand near her knife and her face doing the thing where it was completely controlled and completely honest simultaneously. He looked at Duskveil, who was looking at the walls with the expression of a woman watching a construction she spent decades building reveal its actual foundation. He looked at Cress. He looked at Holt. He looked at everything he had built and everything it was going to cost to keep it, and the specific shape of the choice in front of him. Not the institutional choice, not the strategic calculation, but the raw and irreducible version. Stand here with these particular people against this particular force, or don't. He had already made this choice. He had made it at the creek. He had made it in the Undercroft. He had made it with his hand around a stone that permanently bound his life to a 7-year-old's. He pulled his sword. Cress, he said, get every available body to the walls. I want the east gate sealed and the northern approach funneled to the main courtyard. He turned to Holt. The frequency device. It's larger than the one in the forest. Find it, get within range, and take it apart the same way. Do not engage the main force, just the device. Holt was already moving. And the boy? Seraphine said. Vaelor looked at Kalen. Kalen was still looking at the walls, and the light around his hands was back, quiet, controlled, banked. And his expression was the expression of someone who has arrived at a place they have been moving toward without knowing it, and has found that it is exactly what they expected, and nothing like what they feared. The bond amplifies both of us, Vaelor said. If the device activates at full strength, it activates through you, Seraphine said. Yes. And through him. Yes. She looked at him for one long moment. The look that contained everything she had not said and would not say, because this was not the moment for saying it. And she was, above everything, a person who understood the relationship between moments and words. Then make sure it's worth it, she said. He met her eyes. It already is, he said. The army hit the outer wall. The sound of it was enormous. Not just loud, but total. The kind of sound that occupies the entire sensory field and leaves no space for anything else. The sound of 400 people committed to a single direction. The crystal lanterns along the garden corridor shuddered. Somewhere in the palace above them, something fell. And in the courtyard beyond the open wall of the garden corridor, the air changed. The frequency began. Kalen's hands lit up amber gold. Vaelor's chest, at the exact point where the bond had settled, lit up the same color, visible through his coat like a lantern through cloth. Duskveil stared at it. She stared at the light in the king's chest, and the light in the child's hands, and the woman standing between them with her knife drawn and her face absolutely clear. And something happened in her expression that had not happened once in the entirety of the night. She understood, not strategically, not politically. She understood in the way a person understands something they have been refusing to understand, when the refusal finally exceeds the capacity of the thing doing the refusing. What she had called contamination, what she had called instability, what she had spent decades trying to prevent, was standing in front of her, and it was not what she had said it was. The outer gate cracked, the courtyard filled with the sound of Covenant soldiers pouring through, and Vaelor Nightbane, King of Silver Peak, Alpha of the Consolidated Empire, the man who had ended generations of war by deciding that the world could be built differently than it had been, turned toward the courtyard with a sword in his hand and light in his chest, and beside him a woman who had survived 7 years alone and was not afraid of anything the world currently had to offer, and in front of both of them a child with fire in his hands, who had been waiting his entire short life to stop running. The battle for Moonspire began. The courtyard became the world. Everything outside it, the palace walls, the mountain dark, the politics and declarations and 15 years of careful institution building, compressed to the periphery and left only this, torchlight and shouting, the crack of weapons against stone, and 400 Covenant soldiers pouring through a gate that had held longer than it had any right to. Vaelor did not think about strategy at the moment of contact. There was no room for strategy at the moment of contact. There was only the body's accumulated knowledge, everything that decades of training had written into muscle and bone, and the specific reflexes that engage before the thinking mind has finished its sentence. He moved through the first wave the way a river moves through a narrow channel. Not elegantly, not with the controlled precision of a practice yard, but with the raw, purposeful force of something that has no option other than forward. The bond was active. He felt it with every step. That steady amber warmth in his chest, the sense of a second life force running alongside his, not merged but joined like two rivers sharing a bank. It did not slow him. It grounded him, which was different. He knew where Kaelin was at every moment without looking, the way a man knows the position of his own hands in the dark. Behind him, Seraphine was not behind him. She was on his left. He had not told her to be there. She had simply positioned herself with the efficient practicality of a woman who had spent 7 years making tactical decisions alone and did not require instruction to identify the correct placement. She had her knife and the specific quality of movement of a person who fights not from training but from necessity. Not the practiced forms of a soldier, but the direct economical lethality of someone who has learned that survival does not reward excess motion. She was very good. He noted this and moved on. The Covenant's front line was better organized than the Forest Scouts had been. These were soldiers, not acolytes, their movements carrying the pattern of people who had drilled together, who knew each other's spacing, who had been told what they were coming into and had prepared for it. They came in hard, fast, and with the particular momentum of people who believe they have numbers sufficient to make individual skill irrelevant. They were not wrong about the numbers. Cress's people met them at the courtyard's north end, holding a line with the practiced calm of an army that has been trained to hold lines under worse conditions than this. Vaelor heard Cress's voice, flat, continuous, the specific cadence of a general managing a moving engagement, and the line held. But the frequency device was still active. He could feel it at the bond, the same bone-deep vibration from the thorn veil, but larger, like the difference between a single drum and a full percussion line. It was not aimed at him. It was aimed at the bond's other end, the smaller end, the 7-year-old currently positioned at the garden corridor's threshold with Seraphine's explicit instruction not to move unless the line broke. The bond was absorbing the signal. His chest felt like it was being compressed by a slow, continuous pressure, not sharp, not acute, but relentless, the kind of pressure that compounds over time and becomes critical not through intensity, but through accumulation. He noted it with the part of his brain that maintained a running operational assessment and kept moving. The frequency had to go. He looked for Holt. Holt found the device in 11 minutes. He came back in 14, bleeding from his left arm, a cut from the shoulder to the elbow that was serious but not fatal, moving with the careful gait of a man who has made an internal agreement with his pain to address it later. And behind him the frequency stopped. The cessation was like a door closing. Sudden, total, the absence of the sound revealing how pervasively the sound had been present. In the bond, the compression in Vaelor's chest released, and for 3 seconds the relief of it was so complete that it was almost difficult to continue doing what he was doing. He continued doing what he was doing. Without the frequency, the Covenant's coordination began to fragment. The device had not merely been targeting Kaelin, it had been operating as a command signal, a carrier wave that the soldiers had been using to maintain formation across the courtyard's chaos. With the signal gone, small uncertainties began to compound. Soldiers at the edges of the formation lost the pulse they'd been moving to. Communication between units degraded. The confidence of a force that had arrived believing they had an overwhelming advantage began to develop. At its edges, the early signs of doubt. Doubt in an army is a toxin. It does not kill immediately. It works slowly through the body of the formation, loosening cohesion, making individual soldiers more aware of their own exposure and less certain of their collective power. Kress understood this and pressed the advantage with the economical aggression of someone who has identified exactly where and when to apply pressure. The line began to move. Vaelor, at its center, moved with it. He was bleeding from his right side. A thrust that had gotten through his guard, shallow but insistent. The kind of wound that does not stop a fight but reminds you, every time you turn that direction, that the body's budget has limits. He had been in enough engagements to know the arithmetic. He had enough left to finish this. He had calculated that with the confidence of a man who has read his own reserves accurately enough times that he trusts the reading. What he had not calculated for was Morvana Duskville. She came through the North Passage at the hour's midpoint, and she did not come as a political operator making a measured exit from a plan that had exceeded her control. She came with 12 of her personal soldiers, the ones who had been with her house for decades, the ones whose loyalty was to her rather than to the Covenant's structure. And she came directly toward the center of the courtyard, directly toward where the fight was heaviest, directly toward Vaelor. He saw her through the moving bodies of the engagement. She saw him. The 12 soldiers cleared a path with the efficiency of people who had done this before, and Duskville walked through it with the absolute unhurried certainty of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that the mechanism was finished, and what remained was the thing beneath the mechanism, the thing that had driven it, the conviction that had never required the mechanism to validate it and was not diminished by the mechanism's failure. She stopped 10 feet from him. He stopped. Around them the battle continued, Kress's line pressing, the Covenant force fragmenting further, the courtyard filling with the layered sound of an engagement that had found its resolution and was working through the final motions of it. But in the 10 feet between Vaelor and Duskville, none of that was the primary reality. She was not carrying a weapon. "It's over," he said. "Yes," she said. The admission had no defeat in it. That was the part he had to sit with for a moment. She was not admitting defeat. She was admitting completion, the way a person admits that a long process has reached its end regardless of the outcome. As if the outcome was, on some level, secondary to the fact of the attempt. "Your Covenant allies used you," he said. "They tried to," she said. "I knew they would try to. I built the relationship accordingly." A pause. "What I did not build for was the specific choice you made." The binding. The binding. Her eyes moved to his chest, where the amber warmth of the bond was visible through his coat's fabric. "I knew you were pragmatic. I knew you were capable. I knew you had made difficult choices before and would make them again." She was looking at him with the direct attention of someone conducting a final assessment that is no longer in service of a plan. "I did not know you were capable of that." "Of what, specifically?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Of caring about something that cost you more than it returned," she said. "I built every contingency on the assumption that a king's primary loyalty was to his crown, to the institution, to the continuation of his own authority." She looked at the bond light in his chest. "You bound yourself to a child that imperial law doesn't recognize as having the right to exist. You gave up every institutional safeguard you had. You made yourself legally and physically inseparable from the empire's greatest political liability." She paused. "No king does that." "I did," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." Something shifted in her face then. Not capitulation, not regret, but the specific expression of someone arriving at an understanding that rearranges rather than resolves. The understanding that the world they had constructed their certainty around contained a variable they had not accounted for, and that variable had been present the entire time. She had been certain, and certainty, in the absence of the willingness to be wrong, is the most effective cage a person can build for themselves, because it is entirely invisible from the inside. Duskville had lived inside that cage for decades, and the cage had been comfortable, and had held a view of the world that was internally consistent and formally logical, and entirely wrong at the level of its foundational assumption. The assumption that power was the terminal value, that everything else, love and loyalty and the messy human business of genuine connection, was either instrumental to power or irrelevant to it. That assumption had just run directly into a king who had bound his life force to a 7-year-old and was standing here bleeding from 2 separate wounds, and the assumption had not survived the encounter intact. "Stand down your soldiers," Vaelor said. She looked at him. "And then what?" she said. And then we have a real conversation, he said, about what comes next, about the empire and its laws and what kind of civilization we are actually trying to build here. He held her gaze. I am not interested in destroying you, Morvana. I am interested in what happens after this is over, and you are, whether I like it or not, someone whose intelligence and reach and knowledge of this empire's architecture I cannot afford to simply eliminate. She stared at him. For a long moment, a long, complicated, silent moment in the center of a courtyard that was finishing its battle around them. She just looked at him. He had the impression she was doing what she rarely did, encountering something she had not anticipated and allowing herself to be genuinely uncertain of the appropriate response. She turned to her soldiers. "Stand down," she said. The 12 soldiers stepped back. Across the courtyard, the Covenant's remaining force, diminished, the frequency gone, their formation fractured, their forward momentum entirely spent, began to collapse into surrender pockets as Cress's line moved through the last of their resistance with the grim, methodical efficiency of a trained army finishing a job. The battle for Moonspire ended not with a single decisive moment, but with the gradual, unglamorous process of a large number of people deciding simultaneously that the thing they had been doing was finished. That was how most battles ended in reality, not in the clean, dramatic resolution of a single combat, but in the accumulation of small surrenders, each one making the next more likely, until the aggregate weight of them became undeniable. The courtyard went quiet. The crystal lanterns were still burning. Several of them had been knocked from their brackets during the fighting and lay on the stone, their light spilled sideways, turning the battle's aftermath into something that looked almost gentle in its illumination. The strange, soft quality of aftermath light, the way destruction looks almost peaceful when the noise stops and the light is wrong. Vaelor sheathed his sword. His right side hurt. His hands hurt. He was tired in the specific way of a person who has been running on reserves for several days and has now drawn down to something close to the floor of what's available, the tiredness that lives below the body and somewhere in the part of a person that animates them. He turned toward the garden corridor. Seraphine was there. She was standing on the corridor's threshold, the way she had been standing every time he'd turned to find her, at the edge of the action, positioned correctly, doing what was necessary. Her knife was at her side. She had blood on her coat that was not hers. She was looking at him with those gray eyes that had been reading him since the creek, and what they currently contained was something he had not seen there before. Not the assessment, not the calculation, not the 7 years of survival vigilance. Something quieter, something that arrived after vigilance when vigilance has done its work, and the thing it was protecting has survived. Between them, from the garden corridor's shadow, Kalen walked out. He walked with his hands at his sides and the amber in his eyes soft, the banked warmth of a fire that has not been called on and is simply present. He looked at the courtyard, at the aftermath, the scattered Covenant soldiers, the palace guards' positions, the scattered lantern light, with the focused, steady attention of someone taking inventory rather than assessment. Then he looked at Vaelor. He crossed the courtyard. He stopped in front of Vaelor and looked up at him with the expression that had no armor in it, the expression that had appeared in the Undercroft when the curse broke, the expression that was simply what it was without the forest child's necessary compression. Then he put both arms around Vaelor's waist and pressed his face against his side and held on with the total, uncalculating grip of a child who has decided. Vaelor stood very still for 1 second. Then he put his hand on the back of the boy's head. The aftermath of the battle for Moonspire took days to fully process and months to fully address. In the immediate hours after the courtyard went quiet, there were practical necessities: wounded soldiers, Covenant prisoners, the structural damage to the outer gate, the documentation of Duskvale's declaration and its formal suspension, and the considerably more complicated business of explaining to a council in a city what had happened in their palace in a single night. These things required attention and received it, handled with the organized thoroughness that Cress and Holt between them were entirely capable of providing. Vaelor handled the council himself. He did it the morning after the battle, before he had slept, standing at the head of the obsidian table in the council chamber with his right side dressed, and his hands clean, and the amber warmth of the bond present in his chest, like a second heartbeat. He told them everything. Not a strategic version of everything, Not the version filtered through the management of institutional reaction. Everything. The child, the bloodlines, the binding, the covenant, Duskville's network in the palace, the declaration, the battle. He told it plainly, with the specific quality of directness that belongs to a person who has come through a long night without dying and has arrived on the other side of it no longer interested in the performance of management. The council was quiet for a long time after he finished. Draveth was not at the table. He was in a room in the east wing, under guard but not in chains. Vaelor had made that distinction deliberately, because the distinction mattered. Draveth's daughter had been found that morning in a safe house 3 districts from the palace, unharmed, her location extracted from one of the 3 Covenant soldiers Holt had taken from the corridor. She had been returned to her father before dawn. What came of that, what Draveth was and was not going forward, was a question that required more than a single morning to answer. The man had broken under pressure in a way that had genuine cost. He had also, when given the choice, stood back up. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and the world that Vaelor was trying to build was a world that had room for the complexity of both those things being true about a person, without pretending either one negated the other. "The boy stays," Vaelor said, when the council had been quiet long enough. "He is under royal protection, by formal decree, effective as of last night. The binding makes that question academic at a physical level, but I want it documented legally as well. I want it in the record. The noble families," one of the junior counselors began, "will be addressed individually," Vaelor said. "Those who participated in last night's gathering under Duskville's assembly will be interviewed. Those who had direct knowledge of Covenant involvement will face consequences proportional to that involvement. Those who were there because they were uncertain and frightened and looking for a structure to hold on to." He paused. "Those I'll talk to myself." Another silence. "And the Covenant?" Kress said. "The Covenant's leadership will be identified through the intelligence we have from the prisoners and through Duskville's cooperation." He said cooperation in the flat, neutral tone of a man who has made an offer and is waiting to see if it is accepted. "The organization will be dismantled. That is a long process. We begin it today." The council adjourned. He walked out of the chamber and into the corridor and stood there for a moment with his back against the stone wall and his eyes closed, just breathing. The tiredness was very large. He let it be large for 30 seconds, and then he opened his eyes and walked toward the east wing. She was at the window again. He had a theory about Seraphine and windows that he had not shared with her because it was the kind of observation that required the right moment, and there had not been a right moment yet. The theory was that 7 years of living inside a forest, where every window was the entire sky and the trees, had made her a person for whom windows were not interior/exterior boundaries, but orientation points. The place in a room where the world outside was most available, and therefore the place where a person who had survived by reading the world outside stood as a default. The room looked the same as it had before the battle. The fire was burning, the breakfast tray on the table had been eaten efficiently. Kalen was on the floor near the hearth, asleep, with a piece of parchment under his cheek and charcoal marks on his hands. Whatever he had been drawing had not made it to the parchment. His hands held the marks of extensive preliminary work, and the parchment was mostly blank. He slept with the deep, total quality of a child who has used everything they had and is now rebuilding at the bottom of it. Vaelor sat in the nearest chair. Seraphine turned from the window and looked at him with those gray eyes. "Counsel," she said. "Done. And it will be a long process. Several of them are frightened. Some of them are reasonable. One of them asked me very carefully whether the decree could be worded in a way that didn't set a precedent for future cases, and I explained to him that the precedent was precisely the point." He paused. He didn't look happy about that. "No," she said. "I imagine he didn't." She came away from the window and sat across from him, not at the table but in the second chair, close enough that the conversation could be quiet. The distance between them was the distance it had been since the creek, not social distance, not the carefully maintained space of 2 people observing appropriate boundaries, but the natural distance of 2 people who have been in a sustained crisis together and are now in the first stillness after it and are adjusting to what stillness contains. "You need to sleep," she said. "Later." "Vaelor." He looked at her. She had said his name, just his name, without the weight of instruction or the flat utility of address, in the specific way a person says a name when what they mean is something larger than the name. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Dusk Veal," she said. "What happens to her?" "She's in the West Wing under guard. We've been talking." He rubbed the back of his neck. "She's complicated. What she did was real. The harm she caused was real. The network she built, the people she compromised, the lives that were risked last night, all of that is real and has to be accounted for." He paused. "She also has knowledge of this empire's underground architecture that nobody else alive has. Every corrupt channel, every hidden arrangement, every point of institutional weakness that the Covenant exploited. She built half of those channels herself. She knows where they go. You're going to use her. I'm going to offer her a choice between accountability and collaborative accountability," he said. "There's a difference." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. "You surprise me," she said. "Regularly." "Good," he said. "I'd find it difficult to be interesting otherwise." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her, which was a precise and honest expression of something existing without performance. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the boy on the floor near the hearth, asleep under a fire's warmth, with charcoal on his hands and an almost drawing on a blank parchment. "He tried to draw the bond last night," Vaelor said, "before the battle. I saw him at it in the Undercroft." "He draws everything he can't explain," Seraphine said. "He's been doing it since he was old enough to hold charcoal. The forest, the feeling of the trees, the way the air moved before a storm." She paused. "He drew the Covenant soldiers in the forest 3 days before we knew they were coming. He drew a city. I thought it was invented." Vaelor looked at the parchment, at the blank center of it, and the charcoal marks on the boy's hands that had been meant for something that hadn't quite made it to the page. "What do you think he was trying to draw this time?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her son the way she looked at him, fully, honestly, with the specific quality of attention that does not curate what it sees. "I think he was trying to draw what the bond feels like," she said, "from inside it." Vaelor was quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, Moonspire was beginning its morning, the gradual, ordinary restoration of a city's daily rhythm after a night of extraordinary disruption, the way cities always did, because the metabolism of daily life is more persistent than the interruptions that periodically threaten it. He could hear it beginning, faintly, through the thick stone walls. The movement of people, the distant commerce of a market opening, the specific sound of a civilization resuming itself. "When he wakes up," Vaelor said, "I want to take him to see the city, not as a political object, not with a guard formation and an official route, just the city." Seraphine looked at him. "Is that safe?" she said. "No," he said, "but I'm finished making decisions about his life primarily on the basis of what is safe." He looked at the sleeping boy. "He spent 7 years hidden in a forest so he could be safe. I think what he deserves next is a chance to be something other than safe." She was quiet for a long time. "I'll come," she said. "I know," he said. He slept for 6 hours, which was insufficient and unavoidable, and woke to halt at the door with a report and a cup of something hot that was technically in the category of tea and practically in the category of a strong suggestion that he be functional. He read the report, drank the tea, and went to the East Wing. The three of them walked into Moonspire at mid-morning, in plain coats, with 2 guards who had been selected specifically for their ability to be present without being visible. The city was in the specific post-crisis state that Vaelor had seen before, the tension of the night before hanging in the air like weather that has passed but left the atmosphere changed, people moving with a heightened awareness, conversations in the market stalls carrying an undercurrent of the previous night's news being processed and absorbed and argued over. Kalen walked between them. He had not been in a city before. Vaelor watched him experience it, watched the boy's face as 40,000 lives' worth of ambient presence washed over him in the full sensory register of whatever Kalen used to experience the world. It was not overwhelming in the way that Vaelor had, with some concern, anticipated it might be. It was expansive. The specific expression on the boy's face was not the expression of a person being subjected to too much input. It was the expression of a person discovering that the world is larger than the space they had been given to grow in. He looked at everything. He looked at the crystal lanterns and their brackets, their light unnecessary in midday sunshine, but burning anyway. The way ceremonial things burn regardless of utility because they are not about utility. He looked at the silver-veined stone of the buildings and the way the mountain light caught it and broke it. He looked at the market stalls and the people at them, and at the children who were approximately his age doing approximately child things in the spaces between adult commerce, and his attention to those children had a particular quality: interested, careful, the attention of someone who has never seen people his age and is trying to understand what they constitute. "They're loud," he said. "Yes," Seraphine said. They're not careful the way I had to be careful," he said. He said it without complaint, just observation, the flat, honest notation of a child who has learned the difference between what was necessary and what is possible. "They're just free," Vaelor said. Kaelin looked at him. "Yes," the boy said. They stood together at the edge of the market for a long time, the three of them, watching the city move around them with the ordinary, magnificent complexity of 40,000 people living their lives in proximity. And Vaelor felt the bond warm in his chest, steady, present, permanent in the way that the things we genuinely choose become permanent, and thought about what it meant to build something versus what it meant to protect it. He had spent 15 years believing those were the same project. They were not the same project. Building required the willingness to tear down what existed in order to make space for what should exist. Protecting required something different, something that could not be legislated or enforced or maintained through the strategic application of power, something that had to be chosen continuously by people who understood what it cost and chose it anyway. The empire he had built was a structure. Structures were necessary. Structures were not sufficient. What was sufficient was what he was standing in the middle of right now. This specific, improbable configuration of three people who should not, by any reasonable reading of the world's available forces, have ended up here together, and had ended up here together because each of them had made a series of choices that the available forces hadn't accounted for. He thought about Duskveil's certainty. He thought about the hairline crack in it, that moment in the corridor when she had looked at Kaelin and said, "He's just a child." He thought about what it meant that her certainty had cracked there, not at the battle, not at the political reversal, but at the direct perception of a child's face, as if the entire architecture of her conviction had been built to withstand every force except the simple, stubborn actuality of a specific person being specifically real. That was the thing that institutional cruelty always ultimately failed to account for. The specific reality of specific people. He had known this. He had built laws on this. He had spent 15 years trying to encode it into an empire's operational structure. And the encoding was important, and the encoding was not the thing itself. The thing itself was this: a boy standing in a market with charcoal still faintly visible on his hands, looking at children playing with the expression of someone discovering that belonging is not a quality of blood or decree, but of proximity and recognition and the simple willingness to be present. "What do you want to do?" Vaelor asked. Kaelin looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Today, in the city, what do you want to do?" The boy thought about it with the seriousness he brought to genuine questions, as opposed to the quick, efficient processing he applied to strategic ones. "I want to watch them," he said, indicating the children. "I want to know how it works, how you just exist near other people without it being a strategy." "It's not always without being a strategy," Vaelor said honestly, "but sometimes it is." "Yes," he said, "sometimes it is." Kaelin considered this. "Can I try?" he said. Seraphine made a sound beside him that he would not have recognized a week ago and recognized now as her version of being moved by something while maintaining an appropriate amount of control about it. "Yes," she said. "You can try." He went, not far, 20 feet, toward the edge of the children's space, with the careful approach of someone who has never done this before and is applying to it the same focused attention he applied to counting soldiers in the dark. The children looked at him. He looked at them. There was a brief universal pause of childhood assessment, the specific calibration that children perform when encountering an unknown peer, the rapid silent calculation of whether this person is safe, interesting, or neither. Then one of the children, a girl, approximately Kaelin's age, with the practical directness of a market district child who has not yet learned to be indirect about anything, held out the object she was holding. It was a piece of carved wood, a toy, roughly horse-shaped. Kaelin took it with both hands, carefully, and looked at it with the expression of someone receiving something valuable. Vaelor turned away so the boy didn't see his face. Seraphine said very quietly, "Don't." "I'm not," he said. "You are," she said. He was. He didn't bother to manage it. The performance of composure in front of her had stopped being a viable option somewhere around the creek and had not recovered since. "He's going to be all right," she said. It was not a question and not quite a comfort. It was the statement of a woman who had spent 7 years building the conditions for one specific future and was standing inside the early edges of it, taking inventory. "Yes," he said. "So are you," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at him with those gray eyes, and what they contained, clear, direct, unmanaged, was the thing that had been building since the creek and had survived the Thornvale and the palace corridors and the undercroft and the courtyard, and was still here, still present, apparently constituted of whatever material manages to persist through exactly those conditions. "Seraphine," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to need some time to—" "I know," she said. "It's complicated, and the Empire is—" "I know," she said, in the tone of someone who has been patient with a person taking longer than necessary to say something and is offering them a graceful exit from the sentence. He stopped talking. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked back at her son, who was sitting on the ground with the market district girl and 2 other children, the carved horse in his hands, the children talking to him with the unself-conscious velocity of children who have decided a new person is acceptable and have moved immediately to the next stage of operations. "He's going to want to come back here tomorrow," she said. "I know," Vaelor said, "and the day after." "Yes. So you should probably stop planning the security rotation around the assumption that this is a temporary situation," she said, "and start planning it around the assumption that it isn't." He looked at her. She looked at him. "All right," he said. 3 months later, the rebuilding of Moonspire's outer gate was completed. The new gate was different from the old one. Not larger, not more fortified, but more open, the proportions adjusted to let more light through the archway. The dusk veil crest that had been carved above the original lintel, replaced with something that the Imperial Mason had, following Vaelor's specifications, spent 2 weeks getting right. Not a bloodline crest, not the Nightbane wolf or any of the founding clan markers that had competed for primacy across the Empire's long contested history. Just the mountain. And the lantern light. The kind of thing that existed regardless of which family happened to be standing beneath it. The formal declaration that established Kaelin's protected status was recorded in the Imperial Register on a morning in early spring, in the presence of a council that had spent 3 months arriving through various degrees of discomfort and recalibration, at the position that the world had changed and would benefit from their acknowledgement of that fact. Dravith was at the table. He had been reinstated not to his original position, but to a modified one that was smaller and more closely supervised, and was, in the judgment of a man who understood that people are the accumulation of their choices, and not simply their worst one, appropriate to where he was rather than where he had been. His daughter came to court the following week to thank Vaelor personally. He thanked her for coming and asked about her work, which was the design of water management systems in the eastern districts, which she described with the focused enthusiasm of a person whose life had been briefly interrupted by forces that did not originate from her and had been returned to her intact. He listened and was glad of it, and after she left, he stood at the window of the council chamber for a long time, thinking about what it cost to build a world where that was possible. The ordinary continuation of an ordinary life, by someone who had simply had the misfortune of being adjacent to the machinery of power when it chose to operate. The cost was everything. The cost was the perpetual willingness to pay it. That was the lesson he had not known he was learning until he learned it. He had believed that the project of leadership was the project of building an institution strong enough to outlast the failures of individual people. He had believed that the goal was a structure that operated correctly, regardless of the quality of the humans inside it, that encoded virtue into its mechanics so thoroughly that virtue became the default. That was not wrong. It was incomplete. The institution was the container. The container was necessary. But what filled the container was not encoded virtue. It was chosen loyalty, which was different, which required continuously being worth choosing. An empire held together by law and managed well by capable administration was a better world than an empire held together by fear and managed through violence. He believed that. He had built the better world. But the better world was still only a world. It still ran on the specific decisions of specific people. It still turned at its most fundamental level on whether the person at its center was making choices they would be willing to name plainly in a room with someone who had no reason to flatter them. He thought about Seraphine at the creek, looking at him and asking plainly what he wanted. He thought about what it had felt like to answer honestly. He thought about what it had cost to build a life on something other than honesty for the preceding 15 years, not dishonesty exactly, but the careful management of truth that substituted for it. And he thought about what had changed when that management was no longer adequate to the situation. What had changed was everything. The management came off, and what was underneath the management had turned out to be sufficient, more than sufficient. He turned from the window. Down in the courtyard below, visible through the glass, Kaelin was in the training yard with Holt. Not weapons training. Vaelor had been clear about that. The boy had time, all the time in the world. The weapons could wait. But something else Holt had proposed and executed with the flat creative practicality that characterized most of his best ideas. The training of the boy's other capabilities. The sensory and connective abilities that had no official name yet and were being approached carefully with the patience due to something unprecedented. Kaelin was standing in the center of the training yard with his eyes closed. Around him, at varying distances, 12 palace staff members were standing with objects of different temperatures, hot, cold, ambient, in their hands. The task was identification without looking, simple, manageable. The first of many small exercises being built, with care, toward an understanding of what the boy could do and what it was for, and how it might be used in service of something beyond immediate survival. He was getting them right. He was also, between identifications, talking to the palace staff members in the absent, ongoing way of a child who has discovered that proximity to people is not a threat but a quality, and has been making up for 7 years of deferred proximity ever since. Vaelor watched him. There is a particular moment in the experience of a person who has spent their life building things, who has oriented their entire sense of purpose around the construction of systems and institutions and structures designed to outlast them. When they discover something that is not a system and not an institution and is not designed to outlast anyone but simply exists fully in the present tense, that moment has a specific quality. It is quiet. It does not announce itself. It arrives as a kind of clarity, the way light arrives when something that had been blocking it moves. Vaelor had built an empire. The empire was real. Its value was real. The work that had built it was real. Every difficult choice and every necessary sacrifice, and every morning when the cost of the thing outweighed the visible return, and he had paid the cost anyway because the return was not yet visible. All of that was real. And standing in the council chamber window looking at a boy in a training yard, who was identifying warm objects by feel and describing them to 12 people who were delighted by this in the uncomplicated way of people encountering something genuinely extraordinary. All of that was also real, not competing realities, the same one. The Empire had taught him the value of systems. The boy had taught him the value of what systems were for. Seraphine walked into the training yard and stood beside Holt with a cup of tea, watching her son. She did not look up at the window. She had a quality of presence that did not require confirmation. She existed in a space the way she existed in every space, fully, specifically, without performing it for any audience. He had told her, 3 weeks ago, what the bond felt like from his end. She had listened without interruption, and when he finished, she had been quiet for a long time. And then she had said, with the precise, unadorned honesty that was the thing about her that had changed him most fundamentally, "That is the bravest thing you have described to me." He had wanted to argue. He hadn't, because she was right. Not the binding, not the battle, not the 15 years before either. The willingness to feel the bond. To let the warmth of it sit in his chest and not convert it immediately into strategy or obligation or the manageable language of political alliance. To let it be what it was, the simple, irreducible fact of having chosen to be connected to someone and being glad of the choice every morning when he woke, and it was still there. The prophecy, as it turned out, had been accurate. A child would destroy the kingdom. Kaelin had destroyed the kingdom built on fear and division, and the comfortable certainty that people were most safely understood as categories rather than as people. In its place, something was growing. It was not yet fully formed. It would take years, decades probably, to become what it was trying to become. It would fail in places and succeed in others, and require the continuous, unglamorous labor of people who believed in it without always being able to see its shape clearly. But it was growing towards something that had not existed before. A civilization built on the recognition that every person who had ever been classified as less than, every omega registered as property, every gifted child marked as threat, every exile sent into a forest to disappear, was a resource that had been refused rather than a danger that had been contained. And resources refused do not disappear. They survive, they come back. Sometimes they come back as a woman standing at a creek's edge with no fear in her eyes, willing to die before she surrenders the things she has spent 7 years protecting. Sometimes they come back as a boy with fire in his hands who can feel the difference between 60 soldiers and 70 by the quality of their intent. Sometimes they come back as a king standing at a window, watching a training yard, understanding for the first time that the hardest thing he has ever done was not building the empire. It was learning what the empire was for. The sun was on the silver mountain. The crystal lanterns burned. Below in the courtyard, Kaelin opened his eyes, turned his face upward toward the window, and found it immediately, the way he always found it, without searching, with the direct and unhesitating orientation of the bond. He raised his hand. Vaelor raised his. The empire endured. Not because it was feared, but because someone had finally asked the right question about what it was worth fighting for, and had found that the answer fit inside a single training yard on a spring morning, with a woman drinking tea beside a general and a boy with charcoal on his hands, discovering that the world was larger and kinder than the forest he had been given. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.